Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video, we're back with another review of the most recently finished season of Big Brother Canada. Here we'll be talking about BBCan 12. And BBCan 12 is a season here that I feel like I had a pretty unique experience with, where I'm someone that had been watching BBCan since the very beginning. I'm someone that started watching BBCan all the way back in week 2 of BBCan 1, and since then I've been following the feeds, I've been listening to podcasts about the show, I've been very deep into following the goings on of what's happening in the game, even through BBCan 11, where obviously we had digital dailies there, but I still was very invested in what was happening and still following every little thing that was happening. However, here to BBCan 12, I feel like it's the first season BBCan that I largely feel disconnected with. Not because it's actually a bad season, as I do think if we're stacking this up against many of the seasons in BBCan history, it's certainly not a terrible season. It's largely a pretty average season of the show. However, it is a season that I do feel largely disconnected with. It's a season that, while I'm obviously going to talk about it very extensively in this review, it's a season I simply just did not feel as invested in actually keeping up with what was going on in the season consistently through the season, to where there are many points throughout this season's run where I kind of forgot it was even on, which is very strange for Big Brother Canada. Now, again, as a whole, it's still a solid season with some pretty big moments, some really interesting gameplay, even though it wasn't necessarily good at many points, and a cast that, again, just feels in line with many other BBCan casts. But again, I do feel like the lack of excitement that there was from the online community, and also the very sporadic nature of how the episodes were released, along with how the digital dailies were released, it just led to me just not having much investment in this season. But again, I still think there's a lot to talk about here. We'll obviously still talk very extensively about the season here, so we'll be running through it from beginning to end, starting it off with the premiere, where right away we get introduced to the theme of the show, that being essentially a Hollywood theme. I mean, everything is based around this being BBCan Studios, and we get a new intro to the show that has the players walking through a mansion, and we also get new theme music, and all this felt very strange. I don't know why they did this. Again, it's not anything that really matters in the grand scheme of things, but it does feel like it kind of saps some of the identity from the show to just radically change up the intro for no real reason. But here we do get the reveal that there will be 2 superstars joining the game, obviously 2 returning players, thus seeing shots of 2 people that don't look like Victoria and Anthony, which I will be honest, that did kind of throw me off, considering I felt like it was pretty obvious it was them. But either way, here we do also get Arissa revealing that the digital dailies will be longer and juicier than last season, along with us getting to see some scenes from the first few days, and I will say that's cool. It's cool that they at least attempted to make the digital dailies better. Now, were they in the grand scheme of things? I mean, yes, but not by enough. To where, again, it's a large reason why I didn't feel as invested in this season, because obviously I just didn't feel as attached to the show with how the digital dailies were rolled out. Again, not coming out during weekends. There being other points where they simply just didn't release them for the sake of twists, which has really just sapped all of the excitement for the show for me. And it's also a really humorous juxtaposition that this is also followed up by us getting the massive lists of sponsors from their show, which they talk about this being a record-breaking number of sponsors, because obviously me as a viewer cares about that. I definitely care about how much money you're getting from other people. Again, all this really dumb. Again, really just shows the priorities of production at this point, which is, again, just kind of disappointing. But anyway, we finally obviously get introduced to the cast itself, which initially only includes 12 people, which is actually a very small cast, obviously. Now, obviously, 2 superstars will later join the game, making it 14, but even then, 14 is on the smaller side of things. Well, we've had it before in BBCan 9. It didn't really feel like a formula that I expected them to repeat. Though at the end of the day, I didn't really mind us having a smaller cast here, especially considering how the season ended up being structured to where they actually really needed to expedite certain parts of the game, and again, none of it really feel dragged out. And again, I feel like as a whole, while it is a small cast here, it didn't have any negative impact on the show itself. But through these intro packages, we do see right away that there is a lot of talk about wanting a women's alliance to finally come to roost, which I will say, I mean, it is definitely a very worrying trend that coming into this season that there had not been a female winner since Paris and BBCan 6. So for a lot of the women to be coming into this season with this preconceived notion of wanting a woman to win the game is obviously something that I fully understand, and something that I expected to play a major factor coming into this season. But straight up, I don't feel like this cast really popped through these intro packages here, where again, it just felt like a kind of an overly generic BBCan cast, where I will say someone like Bailey definitely came off as someone that you could tell was going to be an entertaining presence on the show. And there are some other random tidbits to talk about from these other players, like Tola having actually been an alternate, which was strange considering he was one of the only people to get a sympathetic intro package, which makes you question, like, was just almost nobody gonna get one? Lexus ends up being the ex-girlfriend of Drake, which was really random. While Todd ends up being the first player ever from Labrador. So that's something. Todd is someone that coming into the season did feel like such a dud with such a monotone voice and was seemingly so boring at first. So I will say as time went on, I did kind of find how boring he could be kind of humorous. But you obviously see them entering the house where we do get some Dodo content from Elijah spilling wine instantly. Though it's also him that does notice that the bedroom doors are open to where they obviously get bags from winners. Because obviously. But with this smaller cast here, we obviously see an instant worry about there being returnees, to which we see Avery and Dennis really leading the group conversation here and wanting the returnees out first, which is humorous coming from Avery in particular. But here we finally get to reveal the two A-listers, who are, unsurprisingly, Anthony and Spicy V, which again, I think was pretty commonly assumed to be the returnees coming into this season. And I think are two very solid picks here. I mean, Spicy V is someone that I thought was a shoo-in for this cast. I mean, someone that, again, is not a good enough player to have this, like, massively unfair advantage coming into a newbie season, but someone that is also just incredible TV, such a massive character. So we're seeing her here makes a lot of sense. While Anthony, I will say, was a bit more of a question mark for me, not because I didn't want Anthony on the show, I very much did. I always wanted to see Anthony play again. Again, I came out of BB Can 7 looking at Anthony as one of the best big brother players we had ever seen, and to see him play again and get more information on his game was definitely an interesting prospect to me, though again, I think the notion of him playing against all newbies in a season that's formatted in a way that's set up to very clearly benefit the vets, I think it's kind of underwhelming to see that be the way that he returns. But again, we do get a fun introduction to the two here. Let's getting to see their reactions to seeing each other for the first time, to which they very clearly are friends from the outside show, which again is another thing that kind of benefits them here. And they do instantly create a final too, though I will say during their intro packages, I did feel like there was some questionable content there and how they assessed their previous games, from V saying that last time her mistake was not committing to a side, and this time she's going to commit to a ride or die, which, I mean, she doesn't really. And really, at the end of the day, I feel like she kind of just plays the same, just kind of with a better house structure to start the season with, although Anthony comes off really cocky, to which through that he ends up being able to play this more villainous role in the episode, something that I don't think we got as much of in BB Can 7, to which Anthony was always this very cocky presence in the house, but on the show itself with BB Can 7, he was largely underedited, where a lot of the screen time for the pretty boys went to Dane and to Adam, to where obviously Anthony has this much more villainous role on this season, coming off as this overconfident mastermind in a way that I think kind of surprised some people, even though it was kind of exactly what I expected him to be. But he does talk about here how his biggest mistake from last time is that he didn't know what jury management was, and the jury felt betrayed by him, and that's why he lost, which is kind of a misread of why he lost the game, where really the reason why he lost the game is because he went to the end against one of the biggest threats in the entire season, where really for a lot of this season, I feel like we're just seeing him repeat that mistake once again. But anyway, we get to the first challenge where the vets are finally revealed to the other players, to where we do see Avery instantly being giddy over seeing Victoria. Again, funny seeing her going from one of the most anti-vet people to one of the most pro-vet people. But this is where we learn how the first week will be handled here, where we see that the vets will not be competing as they're given safety for the first week, which, I mean, to be fair, is not super egregious. I mean, it is a situation where obviously there are going to be these massive targets on the board and give them safety to make sure they don't go home first. Again, I understand that, though the part that is egregious to me is what comes after. The fact that this competition is not for HOH and instead is just to win safety. And also determine the order that they get to pick which entourage they go in. These entourages essentially being teams, with the vets being the captains, where only the two vets will be competing in the HOH comp, meaning that obviously a vet is guaranteed HOH, and if they do, they win safety for their entire entourage. And again, this is just a format that just so greatly favors the vets in a way that I think is just kind of ridiculous. I mean, this is, again, giving the vets automatic first HOH, a position that, again, has been notorious for being able to allow players to lay the groundwork for the entire game moving forward. Also, again, both vets are safe anyway. And also, they're giving both vets a complete entourage. Essentially, half the house is going to feel connected to these vets because of them being in their group, along with the fact that the winning HOH will now have gratitude from half the house, and the fact that they gave them safety. To where, again, it just feels like this is a situation where production went so far out of their way to give these vets more power in the game, in a situation where I don't even think they needed it. I think Anthony and Victoria would have been in a very good spot, even if these things weren't included in the game. And the fact that they just continued to push in these things to give them more power, which continues on beyond this week with these style of conclusions. Just felt like overkill from my point of view. But also, I feel like it's also not that entertaining of a format either. It's one where, again, like we're ending this first week with less than half of the house even being vulnerable, meaning there's so few options for this first week, meaning that there's less incentive to play that aggressively in this first week for the people that are safe. And through that, again, I just feel like that's also kind of underwhelming here. The comp itself has them holding onto a rope over lava while leaning on a plank. Really a comp that we've seen before on Survivor numerous times, though weirdly, this premiere does end on a cliffhanger before this comp is resolved, which, I mean, in essence guarantees that we're getting this extended week 1, the same way that we got with BB Can 11, which, again, I do like that. I do like the fact that we're not losing a person already in week 2 and what is a very rushed week there, but still a very strange way to end the premiere here without any comp result, especially because it's wrapped up pretty quickly in the next episode where Lexus ends up winning here, a comp win that doesn't end up mattering at all as she ends up being safe from her entourage pick anyway. But again, we do get to them choosing their entourages, which again won't matter outside this 1 week immunity as they dissolve right afterwards. So where it was interesting to see that most people did end up going for Victoria, probably because they assumed that she was probably going to win the HOH comp, considering Victoria is obviously more known for winning competitions than Anthony, who had never won an HOH comp before this. But really following this, a lot of the show obviously ends up being largely revolved around the vets, with us seeing them being added to numerous alliances and them completely running the game from the very beginning here, the house being split along gender lines, with them essentially being in control of both of those sides. Where right away we do see Avery and V instantly create a final 2, while we also see her make V's Angels with Kayla and Donna. And later, we get a fashion showcase from Winners, because that's something we needed, where all the women are obviously together as they prepare for the fashion show, to where we obviously get them formalizing this all-women's alliance that had been prophesized, to where we see them call the alliance Big Sisters, a name that doesn't really get mentioned again after these first few weeks, but Janine ends up being credited on the show for putting this group together, which made it pretty clear who's going to take the fall for this alliance down the road, as we do instantly see Victoria talking about how she always wanted to work with all the girls on her original season, which, I mean, did she? But really her real alliance is with Dougie, which essentially means that she's doing the same thing as last time. Where she then proceeds to leak the girls' alliance to Anthony, with her pinning everything on Janine, making Janine the target for Anthony here, despite her being someone that actually wanted to take Anthony pretty deep into the game, and that's something that does get misconstrued moving forward, with there being a lot of talk about how, Janine was targeting Anthony, when that was never really the case. But here we do see Anthony utilizing this information to pull the guys together and having them all agree to look out for each other, to which he ends up building these pretty strong bonds right away with the likes of Tola and Matthew, and also tries to get in with Todd, though that never really clicks. Though we see Dennis come up to him and say that he wants to work with him, even though Anthony never really trusted him. But it was interesting to see Dennis's perspective of Anthony here, something I do think is something that kind of correlates to just how most people looked at Anthony coming into this season, the fact that he is a extremely loyal player, and through that wanted to work with him, to where while he is a big threat, obviously making it all the way to the end, I don't think people realize how masterful of a player Anthony was on BB Can 7, largely because he, again, got overshadowed by the likes of Dane and by Adam, to where I do think that aspect of his reputation definitely benefited him on this season. But through this, we do eventually get introduced to his relationship with Vivek talking about wanting to work with Anthony due to his knowledge in the game, to where they make a deal to meet up in the morning every day and do very minimal talking outside that, to where it very much did feel like this could have been Anthony's #1 ally throughout the season, only for Vivek to then tell him that he's the biggest threat in the game, to where Anthony ends up getting this pretty funny confessional of him being annoyed at what he said, which, I mean, Anthony ends up being kind of a master of that on this season, of having these incredulous reactions to what people are doing around him in the confessional. But this ends up starting this more frosty relationship between the two that really just ends up leading to Vivek being the main target for the following round, with Anthony putting a lot of work into making Vivek this persona non grata figure in the house. But before the HOH, we do see Anthony and V agree that they don't care who wins, but have to pretend like they do, which it does seem like they do meet up quite often, where it does make you question, how do people not realize that they're working together? Something that people don't really clock until much later on, though we do see them disagreeing on their targets here, with V wanting to target Dennis and Matt, while Anthony's obviously worried about this all-women's group, and instead wanting to target Janine instead. Then we get to the HOH, where Daniel from BB Can 11 is the host for some reason, where, again, I like having having previous players come back to host competitions. This did feel very random, but this ends up being a pretty interesting comp, actually. One that is kind of based on first impressions, and the vets here having to guess what their entourage is thinking. And while this is a game that is very gameable, and we do see Anthony trying to game it by constantly answering Donna and seeming to hope that his team picks up on it, which they never seem to do. I still like having these games that do involve you having to utilize your read of how the house is thinking, which it feels like we've kind of been lacking these sort of comps in recent Big Brother. But through this, we obviously have Donna being annoyed at her being the answer for every question, which, again, seems like she didn't really pick up on any of it, along with Tola also being answered quite a bit here in a situation where by this point Tola had already been thrown under the bus. Or by this point, Tola had already kind of made a mess of his game by making it very clear that he was aware of the all-girls alliance, obviously something that came from Anthony, though through him being the one to actually approach the women about it, it makes him an easy target for the women here. But the initial plan for this comp here was for Victoria to end up winning here, though obviously Anthony, again, not wanting to lose a guy in the house, ends up winning the HOH here instead, being his first ever HOH win, to which he places HOH in a somewhat questionable way. But with that, we do see Anthony's HOH room. Into some pretty decent personal content from Anthony here, and him looking at his photos and seeing a photo of his best friend Buck, who had tragically passed away a week before finding out he was going on the show. And along with that, I really do love the moment of him going to Wendy's, to where obviously through Wendy's they typically get a visit from a loved one or a previous returning player, and here Anthony essentially gets both, and the person there being Dane, which I really like this moment here, showing their relationship having extended beyond just the show, and Dane giving him this pep talk here, which again I thought was really endearing. But also this week we do get the return of the have and have not competition. For some reason, I don't know why they thought this was something we needed on the show, but again, this was boring. But again, strategy wise, it became pretty clear that he was going to end up targeting Janine here, and we do see him have a pretty awkward conversation with her in the HOH room, to which he does mention the fact that a few people have been telling him she's been saying his name, to which Janine is shocked here, as again, she never said his name, and he admits to the fact that, yeah, he is lying here, but and this felt like an unnecessary lie here. I don't know why he really felt like he needed to do this, where his lie here ends up actually causing him some trouble down the road, where Janine obviously picks up on the fact that he's lying to her here, increasing the target on his back, where despite him gloating over how well this HOH ends up playing for him by the end of the week, it does actually end up having the likes of Bailey and Vivek wanting to target him the following week. But also through this, he does expose to her the fact that he knows about the Girls Alliance, which again should have made it very obvious where this information's coming from, but for some reason no one actually ends up having the correct read here, where we do see Janine going back to the women and telling them that she's been set up, and talk about how someone within their alliance has ratted them out, only for us to see Victoria joking about it in the DR, and them for some reason ending up blaming it on Tola, saying that Tola must have outed the Girls Alliance to the men, which again, how does that make any sense? But here Anthony obviously needs a pond, which he's actually put in a pretty sticky situation, and the fact that based on the people that are eligible to be put up, the only women available here are Avery and Kayla, two people that we later find out are in his own alliance, to where he doesn't want to put up a guy, as that would risk that guy going home, which is the entire point of winning this HOH, was to weaken the Girls Alliance. So through that, we do see him eventually deciding on Avery as the pawn, with Avery seemingly taking it pretty well here in a situation where she probably shouldn't, but we do see her pretend to be really emotional, and seeing her talking about her having to hide her alliance with Anthony, which is where we do get the reveal of the Hot Chocolate Alliance, an alliance that includes all the black players in the game, which is also essentially half of the All Girls Alliance plus Anthony, which is an alliance that does run the early portions of this game, but also an alliance that was very fractured, which kind of led to the messiness of the season. But through this alliance, it made it pretty clear that Janine was pretty screwed if she didn't win the veto, as in this spot, the women within Hot Chocolate were not willing to go against Anthony's wishes. Through that, Janine really needed to win the veto here, to which she then proceeds to get a pretty terrible draw. A lot of the stronger men get picked here, to where while she does come pretty close in the veto comp, which ends up being this memorization challenge of them having to recreate this board of symbols, she does end up coming in second here, in a situation where Avery herself talked about wanting to make sure the nomination stayed the same when she's on the block, which is like, why? But Dennis out of nowhere ends up winning here, talking about wanting to win to show how good of a competitor he is, which is stupid. Why are you doing this? There's no point. Again, you were safe anyway. He was literally one of the safe people this week. It makes no sense why he won this competition, and it really just expedites his target on his back. That really ends up leading to his later downfall. But on the episodes, we do waste a lot of time on people campaigning to Dennis for him to not use the veto in a spot where he was just kind of obviously not going to use it. So there definitely is an argument for it being the optimal move for him to use it. I mean, again, a spot where it can't really backfire on him immediately, considering the fact that the pool of people to be renominated is extremely small, and through that, essentially, Anthony would be forced to take out one of his own numbers if the veto was used here, and through that would obviously upset the overall power structure. And I do think there definitely was an argument for the move being made here, though it didn't seem like Dennis was ever actually going to do it. But through this, we also get the start of the Matt and Lexus showmance, which was boring, but it did actually sow some distrust between Lexus and the other girls, with Spicy V for some reason deciding to rile the girls up in his target on Lexus's back, only to then go to Lexus and tell Lexus that the girls are talking about these things, only to then put all the blame onto Donna, making Donna a bigger target and putting her at the bottom of the Girls Alliance, again, for no real reason. Where Spicy V just says that drama is good for her game, which it's like, it isn't. Like, all this was just so unnecessary and just showing how sloppy of a player she ends up being here. And along with that, we also get a lot of talk about how Vivek is the very clear target for the following round, where Vivek ends up essentially being a scapegoat by the end of this week, of being the person that Janine for some reason blames, with Janine eventually being convinced that it was Vivek that threw her under the bus instead of Tola, which is also ridiculous here, where even in her eviction speech she calls out Vivek for some reason, which is all dumb. And along with that, we get even more sloppy play from Victoria, to where Janine tells Victoria that she's suspicious of Vivek, only for Victoria to admit to the fact that she told Anthony about the All Girls Alliance, but saying that she did it after Vivek did, and also proceeds to say that she has an alliance with Anthony, but that alliance is already broken up. Which, why are you saying this? This doesn't make sense. It's not even like this is jury management or anything, as, again, Janine's the first boot. Like, all you're doing is giving her ammunition to use against you, and while she doesn't, again, this was still an astronomically dumb play, but either way, with that, we get a unanimous Janine vote by the time of the eviction, to where, on her way out, she does proceed to say that Donna is gonna win this game, which ends up starting this funny trend in the pre-jury of people being asked who's gonna win, only for the person that they say to be the next person evicted. But with that, we obviously lose Janine, and Janine didn't really do much for me on the show. I mean, she's someone that I was actually pretty excited for coming into this season, someone that I actually thought had some potential, someone that was a super fan, someone that, again, seemed to be very pro this women's alliance that we did actually see come together. And really, had it not been for the likes of Spicy V, I think Janine could have actually had a pretty deep run in her. But again, I think she is very unlucky with the vets being included in the game, putting her in this position to where, again, she gets all the blame for the All Girls Alliance, which gets ratted out between these two vets, along with the fact that Anthony is someone that I think just inherently is someone that's not really going to work with the Janine style figure. Again, we see him kind of do a similar thing to Kaylin back in BB Can 7, to where, again, I think Janine kind of gets unlucky in that way, though also does really squander some opportunities she could have utilized to stay in the game. So really, by the end of it, she obviously isn't a particularly good player, but someone that I do think got some pretty bad draws coming into the season. But now for week 2, where we do get an HOH that I think is actually kind of interesting in concept, though terrible in execution. It being an HOH that is essentially a social strategy game. Them having to get water from a tank and then spit it into a tube, with each tube representing a player, and whenever a tube is filled up, that player is eliminated from the game, essentially guaranteeing that this HOH will go to the majority alliance, which, again, as I mentioned before, this is a situation that largely benefits the vets. It's a situation where, again, the vets were already handed a majority alliance in week 1. They were playing this position where they were given all the tools to form a majority alliance, and now in week 2, we have an HOH that essentially guarantees that they maintain control of the game. It's a game where there's really no chance of someone outside of their alliance to win HOH, as they'll just be automatically taken out because of the social strategy aspects of this challenge. So where, again, it feels like this is a situation where production probably did a bit much for my liking, but I still feel like the comp itself played out in a somewhat interesting way, where while we do end up losing Vivek right away, as expected, really screwing him over there, we do then proceed to see the girls really just expose their pecking order, with us seeing the guys being taken out one by one, allowing Anthony to, again, take advantage of the situation, really riling the guys up on the side about how the women are really running things, all for us to then proceed to see the women within the Hot Chocolate Alliance proceed to take out Bailey and Donna right afterwards. However, it's here where we do see Victoria talk about not wanting to win, as she made good relationships during week 1, where she is pretty locked safe in the game at this point, with no one coming for her having connections with pretty much everybody, to where, again, she would have a tough time if she wins HOH, and what do you know? She wins HOH with her changing her mind at the last second, and then proceeding to immediately regret it. because that's Victoria for you. But through that, I mean, again, this should have been a pretty easy week for her. It should have been a situation where most people were okay with Vivek being the target here. And she just start with that plan. Again, talking about putting up Vivek alongside a pawn, but with Spicy V being Spicy V, this week obviously becomes a lot more complicated than it needs to be. Some of it starting from some pretty poor play from Vivek here, and him talking to Anthony and revealing to Anthony the fact that the East Coasters had an alliance. That included him, Bailey, Todd, and Donna, which Anthony ends up proceeding to tell Spicy V about, to which he ends up trying to use this information to her benefit. First going to Donna and testing her about this alliance, which Donna ends up failing, increasing the target on her back, though also proceeds to go to Vivek and tries to get him to admit to the fact that he's in this alliance so that she can use this against him, essentially trapping him here. To which all this ends up being pretty sloppy play from her, and her very much alluding to Vivek the fact that one of his own alliance members had ratted him out, which does end up proceeding to have Vivek own up to the alliance, only for her to then pretend like that wasn't the alliance she was talking about, which made no real sense. And through this, again, should have exposed Victoria's relationship with Anthony, as Anthony was the only person Vivek told, which essentially means that it was very likely this information came from Anthony. But the ironic thing is that Vivek also felt like he needed Anthony in the game, and if he did expose Anthony in this situation, then that ruins his chances of staying in the game. So again, it is this tough position for Vivek to be in particular. And to be fair, I can understand to a degree why Victoria is doing this. Obviously, she's doing this because she wants Bailey and Donna to be on board with this plan in a situation where Bailey did not want to go for Vivek. Bailey instead wanted to go for Tola first. But again, V uses this information to tell Bailey that Vivek threw her under the bus. Again, leading to this pretty great fight in the HOH room, which really showed Bailey's perpetuity for getting confrontations right away, which was all a fun moment, but again, completely unnecessary from Victoria's end, as again, why do you care that much about Bailey and Donna not being on board when literally the entire house is on board? You can rationalize it to them. It's not that big of a deal for you to go this far out of your way to explain why you're going for Vivek instead of Tola, especially in a situation where, again, she pretends like she doesn't even want to go for Vivek, but is now forced to, which just feels like these aspects of her just not really being able to own up to her game and trying to figure out like any way to not take responsibility for anything that happens here. But following this, we do get the reveal of another alliance that Victoria and Anthony are in, that being the Directors Alliance, which is essentially just Hot Chocolate plus Matt and Goose, which I will say it is kind of funny how they just call Elijah Goose on the show at this point without any explanation of why he's called that. But with this alliance getting introduced, that obviously means that Victoria has to nominate someone for that alliance, as she ends up deciding to nominate Elijah as the pawn here, to which he ends up proceeding to be the pawn star of the season, despite him openly saying coming into the season that his biggest fear was to become the pawn star, though also doesn't end up fighting back to that plan here, where Elijah himself talks about how this is risk and reward and that the directors will feel amazing about him if he agrees to it, which is not how this works. It just makes you an easy person to just put on the block continuously. But anyway, Elijah and Vivek end up being nominated here. This is where we do see some tension starting to grow between Victoria and Donna, to where we do see Victoria watching on the spy cam and seeing a conversation between Todd and Donna, to where Victoria is upset at the fact that she's talking to people in her supposed East Coast alliance, to where we do get this awkwardness from her interrupting the conversation. And mixing down the fact that we also see Donna celebrating with Vivek over the Veto pick, it does lead to Victoria realizing that she can't trust Donna and decides to target her. Which, why? Again, all this is so stupid. Again, if you don't trust this East Coast alliance, don't target the person that's in your other alliances of those people. Again, Vivek is someone that you have no connection with. Why are you going to keep Vivek in the game? Even if you don't want to go for Vivek at this point, why not go for Todd? Todd is someone that is more openly close to Donna and that she doesn't have much of a connection with at this point in the season. It is ridiculous that she ends up deciding, no, I'm not going to target these two people I have no connection with within this alliance. I'm going to target the person I do have a connection with. Again, it's pure insanity, but again, it's exactly what you would expect from Victoria. And truth be told, while this is obviously a terrible move at this point in the game, it's not really a game-ending one for her. I mean, Victoria's in this position where she has so many allies. She has so many people wanting to take her far into the game, to where losing one of those people here is not the worst thing in the world, but again, one, she's doing it by her own hand hands, which is really bad. 2, her making this move obviously could very much upset her relationship with Bailey, someone that does want to take still deeper into the game, and also even beyond that, considering her continuously taking out her own numbers through this season, it really does leave her very exposed deeper into the season, largely because she is making moves like this at this point. For all this move wasn't super detrimental at this specific point in the game, it does definitely pay dividends down the road. But again, Vivek ends up getting a pretty fortunate veto pick for him, to where one of the people picked here is Dennis. So we do see Vivek and Dennis becoming a duo through this week, to where obviously that'll end up paying dividends on this season. But it is here where Victoria does, again, decide on fully backdooring Donna, and through that does go to Dennis and tell him to win the veto so he can take Vivek down, in a situation where Dennis assumed that the backdoor was actually on Anthony. To where it is very strange how most people in the house at this point became very aware of the fact that a backdoor was going to happen. Just very few people actually knew the actual plan, that it was going to be Donna going on the block. But again, this does convince Dennis to now go to win the veto, which again, he shouldn't do, just increasing the target on his back to that point. Also, he does also proceed to say to V, don't even tell me who the renom is, which is like, why? Like, very weird that he's intentionally wanting less information about what's going on in the game here. For his sloppy play here, really just ends up causing him to become the #1 target coming into the following round. Speaking of suboptimal play, we also have Elijah, again, being involved in wanting a backdoor to happen here, despite the fact that he's on the block and being okay with the person not taken off the block, which is like, why? You're just making it more likely that you go home, as you're pretty locked safe if Vivek is on the block against you. Against most other people, again, there's at least a chance the vote flips, and again, a lot of it's because he's so confident in the Director's Alliance, but he really shouldn't be. But anyway, we get to the veto comp itself, which ends up being hosted by Dimitris from BB 5 for some reason. Again, cool. Now again, at this point I became pretty convinced that, oh, this must mean that we're getting guests every week of the show, but no, we're not. This is just a random appearance from Dimitris for some reason. But the comp itself ends up being somewhat physical here, and them having to get a block through a rope course and then drop it into a tube, and then after that complete a puzzle with it. Though I did like the addition of the fact that you can only drop it from a certain distance, essentially nullifying the advantage that longer armed people would have in that sort of comp, which we've obviously seen pay dividends in previous Big Brother seasons. So again, nice that they took that to account here. But obviously Dennis ends up winning this veto here, which he really shouldn't do. But to be fair, I mean, it's a less egregious decision than last week, where he had no reason to win the veto last week. But anyway, it is here where we do see Donna starting to pick up on something sketchy happening, realizing that Anthony's always in the HOH and being confused over why, to where with that knowledge, she proceeds to campaign against Anthony, telling Victoria they should backdoor him, which again, some people thought was actually happening here for some reason. Don't know how you thought that was happening here. And again, it's so bizarre that, like, in this world, she's thinking that, oh, Anthony's in the HOH, spending a lot of time with Victoria. That means I can turn Victoria against Anthony somehow? How does that make sense? But either way, though Donna now deciding to target Anthony does lead to this interesting dynamic moving forward of the fact that it does become largely perceived that this was Anthony's move, that this was a move that Anthony was able to convince Victoria to backdoor Donna when it wasn't in Victoria's best interest, when that really was not the case. Anthony had nothing to do with this move and did not even want this move to go through. Again, he spent so much of this week putting this target onto Vivek's back and put so much of his social capital into getting Vivek targeted, to where he was more so annoyed at the fact that that plan didn't go through. And obviously he goes along with it because he's told that, oh, Donna's coming after you. So obviously at that point he knows that he needs to go for Donna, but it's still a situation that he didn't want to go through with here and had almost nothing to do with this move actually occurring. Yeah, for some reason gets a lot of credit for it from his fellow players. But anyway, we get to the veto ceremony where Dennis ends up using the veto on Vivek, and Donna gets blindsided here, leading to some pretty great reactions here, where again, the likes of Bailey, Vivek, Dennis were all blindsided by this renom, along with the fact that Donna is pissed here and walks away from Victoria despite her wanting to talk to her. But we do see the girls do some damage control of Bailey here, saying that they felt like Bailey and Donna were isolating themselves, implying some sort of racial connection there, which again is a fair observation to be had, though is also very ironic considering the fact that literally every other woman in this all-women's alliance is in the Hot Chocolate Alliance. In a way, it did feel like them kind of projecting much, but here we do see Donna actually actually do a pretty decent campaign here, making the girls feel bad for putting her up, and we do see them reconsider this move here to where she did have a pretty decent backing by the time she goes here, again having the votes of Bailey, Todd, and Dennis, and Vivek wanted to keep her, though realized that he didn't have the votes, but the women do ultimately decide with voting her out here, where straight up, I mean, that is the right call to make. I mean, at the point where you already backdoor her, you should not be also keeping her in the game. That would be even more ridiculous. But again, we do see Victoria regretting this backdoor and seemingly convinces herself that Anthony tricked her into doing this. When again, the decision to backdoor Donna was made before Anthony even knew about this plan. Again, she uses this to voice her annoyances with Anthony, something that the show doesn't properly represent. The fact that Victoria does a lot to really throw Anthony under the bus throughout this season, which to be fair, I mean, helps them conceal their relationship, though it also does increase the target on Anthony's back, and it is very questionable how much of this was really intentional, but where again here, it did feel like it was largely based on her own delusions of how this week played out. But through this, we also do get a pretty humorous argument between Anthony and Bailey, where Anthony straight up does come off as a pretty big dick here, definitely coming off as pretty condescending, to where I felt like this was a point where people were starting to turn on Anthony on the show, though again, for me, this is kind of what I expected from him, and I did find the ridiculousness of how over the top this was to be kind of humorous. But it's funny that in the Eviction episode, we do follow up all this drama with a movie festival of them creating short film masterpieces on their Samsung S24 Ultra, which was boring. But either way, we lead up to the Eviction where it gets a 7-3 vote. Donna goes home here, to which on her way out, we see Donna and Todd kiss, which came out of left field, which is so strange considering obviously how much BB Can loves to hype up these showmances. The fact that we never really got this segment on the show of this budding showmance between the two, despite it supposedly being there, and this wasn't the first time they kissed, so again, it felt very strange. This really got sprung up on us here, but we do also get a pretty humorous moment at the end of the episode where as Arissa is closing the show and saying, "I am Arissa Cox," we then proceed to see Donna say, "I am Donna Marshall," with Arissa seemingly being annoyed at her messing up the outro. But either way, I mean, we do lose Donna here, and I think it's a shame that we lost Donna here. I did really enjoy Donna's role on this season, to where I thought she was a really great confessionalist. I thought she was a really fun personality on the show. Someone that, again, was playing hard, and while, again, not playing the greatest, definitely play a sloppy game, I do think she largely gets pretty unlucky in how she goes out here with her, again, having this presence in Spicy V, just really tanking her game for no real reason. Now, obviously, there is these criticisms of, oh, she didn't secure Spicy V's loyalty well enough, but I really don't feel like she does that much actively wrong to cause her boot here, where it just felt like Spicy V must have just had this vendetta against her from the very beginning. And considering the fact that she had these like pretty solid numbers on her way out, again, it comes close to staying. I actually feel like Donna could be a pretty good player, and someone like kind of saw this like Cassandra sort of potential from her, though obviously we'll never really end up seeing that. But now for week 3, where we start off with a pretty interesting HOH comp here, one that is clearly a modification of Buzzkilled, which has always been one of my favorite BB Can comps. Obviously last time we saw it, it didn't work out particularly well if the buzzer's not working. Here it felt like they found this workaround for it, and it essentially being them having to run to these lights at a specific time, which was an interesting spin on the formula. Now I will say it does feel very prone for riggage here of them being able to turn on lights closer to the people that they want to win the comp, though again, not really saying that they're doing that. I just think this is a comp that it definitely leaves that open, but through that we also get temptations here from the likes of sushi and alcohol and slot passes, and obviously Roberto from BB Can 11 giving massages for some reason, which was so random. But also we see safety being doled out here, which Avery ends up getting, but the comp itself ends up coming down to Kayla or Vivek, with Vivek winning the competition here, a result that very much upset what most players wanted coming into this week, that being Dennis being the target, considering it was very clear how big of a threat Dennis was in the game at this point. But with Vivek being his number one ally, again, there was no way that Dennis was going to be targeted here, right? But obviously instead he does initially target Bailey here. Still a short-sighted move in the grand scheme of things. Again, targeting someone that doesn't really have much agency in the game. Someone that is definitely not in that big of a power position, and a move that, again, considering Vivek's not particularly high on the power structure, it's not really shaking up the power structure to put him in that good of a spot. But again, it's at least someone that is coming for him. That's at least something. It's not the worst move in the world. And to be fair, Bailey doesn't do much to really help her here either. Again, we see her talk to Vivek, and instead of campaigning to him, she proceeds to blame him for what happened the previous week, and for some reason still doesn't realize that it was Spicy V pinning them against each other. Or again, it's funny for her to use Spicy V as her alibi, only for V to then throw Bailey under the bus and campaign to get her on the block. But through this week, we do see Vivek actually do some decent work early on in rebuilding his relationship with Anthony, in a way that I did feel like Anthony actually genuinely trusted Vivek at this point, where while again, Vivek's not particularly high in any power structure, at least felt like this is a situation where Anthony would ideally want to keep Vivek around a bit further in the game. However, through this does lead to some tension between Vivek and Dennis, with Dennis obviously wanting to target Anthony at this point, something that Vivek immediately shuts down, leading to Dennis shifting that plan onto taking out Tola, something that Vivek is a little bit more open to. So while he still wants the target to be Bailey, he does tell Dennis that he will nominate Tola here as a pawn, a decision that he proceeds to not go through with and instead use Elijah as a pawn once again, as again shows you how bad of a move it was for Elijah to agree to be a pawn the previous week, as again just made him an easy person to nominate again here. But again, also should show Dennis that again it's not looking good for him. The fact that his own closest ally won't even do something they agreed upon. But with Bailey and Elijah on the block, this actually did open up a potentially interesting vote had these remain the noms by the end of the week, in a situation where again, like, Bailey is much closer to the women of the house, while Elijah is someone that wasn't particularly close to the men, but at least was someone not close to the women. And it would have been this proxy war here where Victoria and the women were obviously going to very much back Bailey, while Anthony and the men were going to back Elijah, which could have been this interesting vote. And straight, I would give the odds to Elijah going home here, considering Todd was the swing vote, and Todd was someone that was much closer to Bailey. Though at the same time, you never know what magic Anthony's going to pull out of his pocket. But again, obviously none of that ends up really mattering anyway. But again, we get to the veto comp, which ends up having them having to solve a puzzle while periodically having to lay down and hold down a button. Obviously a modification of like the coffin challenge that we saw back in like BB Can 5, of them getting distractions along the way. One of the distractions here being Karen from BB Can 5 for some reason. Again, Karen's obviously an incredible character here, but also again just super random, her just being randomly added here. But again, at least more entertaining than Roberto was. But humorously, Dennis ends up being picked for the veto here. They'll proceeds to decide to throw it, as I guess now he's finally worried about the target on his back, leading to Kayla winning the veto here instead, with her instantly wanting to take Bailey off the block, which she does so to show trust to Bailey. Though I do think it's actually kind of a questionable move here, as it is a situation where obviously through taking Bailey off the block, she opens up the situation where one of her other allies could potentially go up on the block. But even beyond that, it also makes it clear to Elijah that you're not with him. Where obviously through them taking Elijah off the block, obviously through the notion of them taking Bailey off the block, it does open up the situation where Elijah stays in the game. And through that, it just makes Elijah aware of the fact that you're now not fully with him. Now you're closer to Bailey than you are to him, which again, I do think is a suboptimal play there. But it is at this point where knowing that a replacement nominee is going to be needed, where we get Anthony talking about how Dennis is the biggest target in the game and the best move would be to get Vivek to backdoor him, where we see Anthony going to Vivek and mention the idea of going for Dennis, something that Vivek initially shuts down, though we do see Anthony propose an alliance between him, Vivek, Kayla, and Victoria, making Vivek now think that he has this new group of allies, all while also telling him that if he doesn't go for Dennis here, that everyone will nominate him the following week next to Dennis, to where if Dennis wins the veto, Vivek's obviously very likely to go home, to which we eventually see Vivek relenting here. So we get this great edit of Anthony shrugging his shoulders in DR. And obviously this is a terrible move for Vivek. I mean, this is another instance of, for some reason, people just openly taking out their closest ally in the game. Again, we've seen this so many times in BB Can history. We saw this with Ryan taking out Andrew. We saw this with Gino taking out Kyle Moore. We saw this with even like Raul taking out Mitch. In these situations where people are taking out their allies for no reason. Where obviously by making this move here, you're taking out someone that is pretty loyal to you. You're taking out a person that is also a bigger target than you, and also now making it well aware to the other players that you're willing to backstab your number one ally. Sure, I think this is almost always, this early on in the game, a terrible move to be making, even though I actually don't think it actually ends up harming his short long-term position that much. I mean, it's actually a move where, again, like through doing this, I think he does build some social capital with Anthony to where it does take him being screwed over by a twist the following round for him to actually get taken out. But while again, he is taken out due to the dividends of this move in the following round, it was unlucky that was a situation that could occur. Though again, it is still a terrible move. It definitely harms his long-term position with no one really wanting to take him particularly deep in the game. And even then, by the end of this week, I mean, even the women were talking about still targeting Vivek the following round. So again, it is still a bad move, but it doesn't actually end up screwing him over as much as you would think, at least initially. And while I know a lot of people were frustrated at this move occurring, thinking of like, oh, this is just continuing the steamroll that Anthony's having in the game, I actually didn't mind it. I thought it was entertaining on the show as we do get to the veto ceremony, where obviously Kayla ends up using the veto on Bailey, leading to Vivek saying that this is the most difficult decision he's ever made. And we see him struggling to get through his speech, only to proceed to blindside Dennis. But let's get a great reaction from Dennis here. Pretty much exactly what you would want from someone on his way out. Talking about how he's going to burn this house down and how this is the single most hurtful thing that's ever happened to him. With, again, this being a pretty brutal betrayal. I mean, this is a situation where Dennis literally used the veto on him the previous week and was his only ally in this position where Vivek was a dead man walking. And for Vivek to then win HOH and proceed to actually take Dennis out during his own reign is pretty insane. So while again, it is really dumb gameplay-wise, at least made for good TV here. We get this confrontation between the two where Dennis has some great lines here saying, I literally saved you and you killed me, calling him the betrayer. I regret nothing in my life, but I regret taking you off the block. Saying, how are you going to win if I'm not around? And that you're next and you know you're next. Only for Vivek to then say, I won't be next. Which, again, is the interesting thing about all this, and the fact that Vivek genuinely believes this was a good move for his game. So again, it is humorous to see Vivek be very emotional in this instance, feeling terrible about what he's done, but 100% backing this from a game perspective. Of him genuinely thinking this was the correct move in the game, when again, it just is a move that further sinks his long-term potential in the game. Which is what makes it even more humorous, where we get more conversations throughout this week between Vivek and Dennis, with Vivek continuously supporting this move, which makes it even more funny now in retrospect. But following all this drama, we then proceed to get a skip the dishes segments, where they have to balance an egg on a spoon for 30 minutes to win a meal, which again, the juxtaposition there was really weird. But following this, we do see Dennis actually going again another pretty decent campaign for this season. One where he does seem to do the optimal strat here of going all in on this very anti-Anthony campaign, trying to appease the women's side of the house, trying to get the votes of the likes of Bailey, Victoria, Kayla, Avery, also Todd. And again, I do think it was somewhat effective here. It did feel like the women were at least considering it. And along with him also talking about wanting to target Vivek and target the showmance. I think he gave the women a lot to think about here in keeping him, though obviously it doesn't really come to be. And in many ways, this feels very reminiscent to me of the Heisem blindside from BB25, and how, again, I feel like they were making the pretty optimal pitch, and it did seem effective at least at first. But again, we get to the eviction where it ends up being a unanimous Dennis vote off. So we once again get another moment of Anthony coming off pretty cocky in his goodbye message here, saying that Janine, Donna, and Dennis all said my name. People that say my name go out the door, which again, not even true for Janine, but either way, really great goodbye message there. But with that, we do lose Dennis, and I so disappointed to lose Dennis this early. Again, while I don't think Dennis is that good of a player in the grand scheme of things, again, I think he really messed up his first 2 weeks to where he comes into this week the biggest target and really gets his best case scenario of Vivek winning the HOH and even then gets screwed over. Yeah, it's not a good game, but I do think Dennis is someone that at least has some potential. I mean, he's someone that did have a pretty decent strategic mind for the game, at least when it came to his strategic maneuvering through the game. It seemed like he was aware of his position in the game, was willing to make those moves that was necessary to get him out of that position, but just was ineffective in actually getting any of those things through. Also someone that, again, was good at competitions, someone that was liked in the house, and while people were sketched out by him from a gameplay perspective, it did feel like he was mostly liked, and again, did seemingly come relatively close to getting votes on his side. So again, I think this is someone that has potential in the game for sure, but again, I don't think this was a particularly good cast for him here. But again, I did also really like him as a character. I think his downfall here is probably debatably one of my favorites in BB Can history. Again, I think this is just such a great exit from him. Just the betrayal from Vivek on his way out was just such a glorious thing to watch from my point of view. And through that, again, I just found his run this season to be very entertaining. Now for week 4, which ends up being a weird week here, one where most of the events of this week don't truly matter, considering the later twist that really upends everything that happens this week, though despite that, it ends up being a pretty interesting week, largely due to increasing tensions within the Majority Alliance, along with the fact that we get a lot of questionable play through this week. That still made it a somewhat interesting ride, though we do start off with a Q&A HOH of them answering questions about trophies around the house that were essentially just BB Can stats, to where it does come down to Elijah and Spicy V, with V clearly struggling throughout this entire comp of trying to decide on whether or not to throw it, to where we see her saying to herself, "What am I doing?" to where she does proceed to throw it, giving Elijah the HOH here. A very interesting result, obviously, in the fact that Elijah had been the pawn for the previous 2 weeks, and someone that I don't think really anybody knew what he was actually going to be doing coming into this HOH, and what he does end up doing is all very questionable, where we do start off with some intrigue here from Elijah talking about how he doesn't know if he can trust his alliance anymore, as his alliance is okay with him going up, and how Kayla, obviously in the previous week, saved Bailey over him. Despite this distrust in his alliance, he decides to just go with them anyway, and obviously just only consider the people not in his alliance as potential nominees here, to where Elijah does end up deciding on targeting Bailey, someone that is a pretty decent target for him here. I mean, someone that was targeting him in the previous round and wanted him out of the house, to where, again, if Bailey had gone home this week, that would not have been a terrible move for him. And we do see him create this initial plan of putting up Bailey and Todd, which would have been a really interesting round of gameplay had that occurred, as again, it would have been another round similar to the previous round of this proxy war between Anthony and Victoria, of them fighting for their pawns. Obviously, these noms don't end up going through, where we do then get a shift of perspective to Tola, who had been largely invisible in the show up to this point, but here we do see him finally do something in telling Elijah what happened the previous week, telling him that Kayla was throwing him under the bus and trying to save Dennis, which Kayla does later end up completely refuting, despite the fact that, again, she wasn't on it. Now, again, at the end of the day, it was all the women that were considering this plan. It wasn't just Kayla, to where obviously the fact that she's the only one to be called out here would be something I would be annoyed with if I was her, though, again, for her to continuously act like she had nothing to do with this was kind of funny through this week. But again, it does cause Elijah to rat out Tola, making Kayla gung-ho over targeting him, to where that does lead to Elijah switching his nom from Bailey to Tola, which again is funny that he decides to nominate Tola after Tola literally just gave him genuine information about what happened the previous week and about who wanted him out of the game. But what's strange about all this is that he's putting Tola up in place of Bailey, despite the fact that Bailey is still his target, to where while he does proceed to say following this that he's okay with Tola going home and Tola would be his secondary option, again, then why not just put up Tola and Bailey if you're gonna do that? To where, like, why do you feel the need to backdoor Bailey, someone that hasn't really shown up to this point that much perpetually to win competitions? And the justification he uses here, putting Tola on the block, is that Tola's good at competitions and can win the veto. But again, this entire plan doesn't really make sense here. It just feels like he's burning his relationship with Tola for no real reason, which just entirely felt misguided, as again, he's risking Tola going home in a position where if Tola does go home, he's essentially empowering this group that previously wanted to vote him out in the previous round, a group that had been playing him for most of this season, a situation where he didn't realize that up to this point. But also the strange thing is that Tola wouldn't even gone home anyway. Sure, if Tola does stay on the block against Todd, as what it was going to be had the later twist not occurred, Tola was staying anyway. To where again, he's really just burning his relationship with Tola here for no real reason, and actually just making it more likely that the person that he actually wants to keep the most safe in Todd does end up going home. So all this was just, again, very questionable play. But again, we do get the Todd Tola nominations, to which at the ceremony itself, we do get a pretty funny moment from Elijah saying Todd's name and Todd not knowing what to do because he's never watched Big Brother before, where he just sits there before realizing that he has to actually get up and go to the nomination chair. But this does lead up to the veto comp, which the comp itself ends up being one that I've always personally really liked, where you have the bid on how quickly you can finish these tasks, and has this like added layer strategy I've always liked. But Lexus ends up winning the comp here. So initially, she does end up wanting to save Tola, where at this point, Lexus had essentially been kicked out of the Girls Alliance and was now closer to the likes of Matt and Anthony and Tola. To where this week we get even more tension between Lexus and the other girls, where we see the other women talk about trying to get Elijah to backdoor Matt, leading to Elijah ratting this back out to Matt, though really pinning a lot of the blame onto Bailey there. Though obviously still this leads to the Anthony side of things still being suspicious of what the women are doing, to where we do see Matt warning Elijah about the other women, only for Elijah to then rat Matt out to the women, again furthering this tension between the Anthony and Spicy V sides of the house, with again Kayla taking a lot of the brunt of the blame for the Spicy V side of things, where it does feel like it's this point in the game where her game starts to unravel a bit, and her becoming a pretty clear target within the Hot Chocolate Alliance. And we do get a pretty funny moment from all this of Kayla ranting about Matt and wanting him gone, only for Matt to enter the room, and her then pretending to have been ranting about slop and clearly using slop as this analogy for Matt, which was all humorous. But in essence, through all this, Elijah ends up essentially accidentally stopping his own backdoor plan, as through the paranoia that caused here through him ratting out information constantly, it does lead to Lexus deciding to not use the veto, obviously not wanting to risk Matt going on the block. But Elijah himself ends up being blindsided by the veto not being used. But this does lead to Lexus and Elijah comparing notes, and Elijah realizing that the girls have been playing him the entire time, leading to him finally throwing Victoria under the bus, revealing that she had actually wanted him to put up Matt and Lexus. With this information, again, obviously getting back to Victoria, which again, to credit Victoria here, she does end up really turning this all around on Elijah, making him persona non grata moving forward, and making him a pretty clear target for a lot of the house coming into the following round. However, this is also where we see Anthony putting in some pretty decent work with Elijah here, seeming to get him on his side, which did seem pretty effective for a bit. Seeming like Anthony picking up a number from V's side, only for him to kind of let go of that by the following round, which was strange. Which definitely felt like a misplay from Anthony there. But as for the campaigning itself, again, we do see a lot of the women wanting to keep Todd around. However, by the time of the actual eviction, the women were going to fold here. As well, we do see Anthony and V fighting over why does Anthony always get his way, which is happening because V is throwing her own allies under the bus and targeting them. But they still did not want to burn their relationship with Anthony here, especially for someone like Todd, who's not really that integral of a number for them. But again, none of that matters anyway, as we do get to the eviction episode where we get the reveal of the executive veto twist, which was really hyped up on this season from the very beginning. And while it does lead up to a pretty great TV moments, I do feel like the twist itself here was actually a pretty bad one that just so happened to work out for them. Well, we do start off the episode showing the executive veto being missing from the trophy room, to where Tola ends up seeing it being gone, to where we see him freaking out and going to search for it, all for that to lead to nothing, which was like, why was that in the show? But eventually they are called to the executive meeting where they find out someone is going home tonight, where we get the first ever chain of rejection, aka a reverse safety chain, essentially a safety chain where you are picking who you don't want to win the power, with the last person standing obviously getting the executive veto, a format that is actually really terrible. Again, it's just another twist here that just gives more power to the majority. It's something that guarantees the best position player in the house gets this massive power, and also in essence is again very much benefiting the vets. Another twist here that feels like it was included, despite the fact that it obviously clearly goes against what twists should fundamentally do and shake up the power structure, because they want to help the vets maintain power in the game. Now, the chain itself ends up pretty much going as expected here, with the people outside of the Core Alliance going out one by one, only for Lexus to be the first of the Core Alliance to be picked, and her actually making a pretty good move here in taking out Matthew before targeting the Hot Chocolate Alliance, a move that does actually gain her some favor back with the women and obviously proves her loyalty to them, even though again she was obviously more loyal to the Anthony side of things by this point. But the chain does end up with Anthony being the decision maker between Avery and Victoria, to where he decides to give that power to Victoria, which he claims he was doing so to test her in the game, a test that she ends up pretty much failing at. But this is where we do find out the executive veto's powers, which is essentially a diamond power of veto, though a slightly worse version of it, to where, though a pretty watered down version of it that actually made it kind of balanced here. And the fact that she can take down one of the nominees, though, again, unlike the Diamond Power veto, she's not able to pick who the replacement is, and instead, the person that was taken off the block gets to pick who the replacement is. Where it gets explained here as that's because, like an executive, someone else is going to do your dirty work. But doesn't that also mean that it's not necessarily your dirty work? Again, that was a very strange explanation to me, but again, a pretty inoffensive version of the veto here in my eyes, where, again, they definitely have had more egregious twists in BB Can's past, but obviously we do get a lot of campaigning here on how the veto is going to be used, where you see Tola wanting Victoria to use the veto on him, though Tola wants to target Bailey in this situation, something that Victoria obviously doesn't want, and Victoria herself is very hesitant to give him a proper answer here, which should have been a clear sign to Tola that Victoria is not on his side, but they end up making a deal here that if the veto is used, that they're going to put up Vivek, though V does end up making deals with both Tola and Todd here, that the veto is used on them, that they'll put up Vivek, which again, I mean, Vivek was pretty safe throughout a lot of this week, though obviously he was never in a particularly great spot, particularly with the women, and with Spicy V being the sole determining factor on who gets nominated here. I do think Vivek is a decent enough target for her. Now, technically, probably Tola is a more ideal target, though again, obviously, I don't think she could have gotten Tola out, as Anthony would have fought a lot harder for Tola than for Vivek. So while I don't necessarily agree with how Spicy V ends up playing this round here, I do feel like her actual target of Vivek is actually not a bad choice, but the problem is that the way to get there is one that she very much wavers on, to where she does end up talking to Anthony, to where Anthony gets her to agree to use the veto on Tola, convincing her that Tola will pick Vivek, despite the fact that he secretly wanted Tola to nominate Bailey anyway. Oh, well, Victoria then proceeds to tell Bailey that Tola's getting the veto, only for Bailey to then freak out, and give credit to Bailey here, does pretty good work in getting Victoria to switch back onto using the veto on Todd, which does end up going through, despite the fact that for Victoria, she also could have just not used the veto, which, I mean, may have also been a decent move for her, where it really would allow her to avoid really showing her cards here to Anthony, where due to her fighting so hard to get Vivek out in this situation and saving Bailey and Todd, it does end up causing a bit of a fracture between them that really gets further expanded in the following week. Though again, Spicy V being Spicy V, obviously was never not going to use the veto, which I will say also, I don't know why there was even an ability to not use the veto. I do feel like it's strange that production even allowed that to be an option, as you would think that they wouldn't want that to be an option, and I actually think the twist is maybe more balanced if there isn't an option, as again, this is a twist that inherently will just give this power to the majority alliance, to where I think there's a lot of instances where, again, if the person that got the power wasn't Spicy V, they would simply just not use the power, through that make it just kind of a dud, to where you would think that they would try to guarantee that ends up being used. But anyway, V ends up using the veto on Todd, to where Todd then does obviously end up picking Vivek, saying that it's because of how quick he turned against Dennis, as that means that he can turn against anybody, obviously being a direct comeuppance to what happened the previous week, which again is a glorious TV moment. I think the downfall of Vivek and his overall storyline on this season is, again, a really tragic downfall that made for really great TV, but I do also just genuinely feel bad for Vivek in this situation, where as we proceed to see through his later campaigning, you can just tell how heartbroken Vivek is in this instance, where, again, Vivek, again, made a bad move. Again, his move to take out Dennis is a terrible move. It's something that, again, from a game perspective, again, the fact that he gets his comeuppance for that makes a lot of sense. However, it's also, again, a comeuppance that he's getting because of a twist. He's essentially getting kind of screwed out of the game in this instance, and kind of taken out in the most brutal way, again, getting sniped out of the game here, with him being directly told it's because of the move that he made in the previous week, and we see him constantly trying to save himself here, only to be constantly rejected, to where, again, we see him go up to Anthony and ask, am I gonna be okay? Only for Anthony to say, you're not gonna have the votes, with Vivek seemingly genuinely being confused about what happened to their 4-person alliance. We also see him proceed to pitch to Bailey and Todd that they can keep each other in the game as these people that are assumed to be coming after each other, again, kind of a way that Godfrey kept Zach in the game for that reason in BB Can 3, yet they just completely shut him down. And we wrap that all up with a public vote, to where everyone has to reveal to his face who they voted for and give a reason reason why, and all this is just so, again, just sad for him. I do genuinely feel bad for this guy that, again, made a bad game move, but that doesn't mean that I don't feel bad for him from a personal standpoint, as he's clearly going to have trouble getting over how his game ended here and how poorly he played the previous week, to where, again, while this was, again, this very grand moment for the show, I do feel like it was still one that I just kind of felt was just kind of sad. But again, with that, we do lose Vivek, and I mean, I've pretty much already said my piece on him. Yeah, I do think he has a very tragic downfall here, probably one of the most tragic storylines in all of BB Can, where, and he's this guy that just never really got his footing and was this like number one target coming into week 2 and was able to barely scrape out of that. He then get power in week 3 and then completely sink his game through that HOH reign and get taken out the following week. Again, it's a pretty tragic fall here, but again, I do think he made for great TV. Again, his actual downfall, fantastic TV. Him blindsiding Dennis, also really great TV. And also, I think he is someone that is an interesting player here. Obviously, he played poorly, but I do think there is still some potential with Vivek. Again, he's someone that is a fan of the show. He clearly knows the show. I do think out of this cast, he definitely was one of the more savvy strategic thinkers at the beginning of the game, being one of the few people that seem to still have these question marks about the vets after they entered the game. Where, again, I think Vivek is someone that, if they were to ever give him a second chance, I would not be opposed to that. Though, obviously, I don't really fully expect it, and it's also a situation where there probably are other people I would rather see back. But now for week 5, where we spend a lot of it early on focusing on the ramifications of the previous round, thus seeing Anthony and Spicy V completely fractured here, with Anthony being annoyed at her for taking Vivek out, saying that giving Spicy V the veto was a test of her loyalty, which she failed at, all while V doesn't trust Anthony for having connections outside of the Hot Chocolate Alliance, even though she also has similar connections. But either way, we do get to the HOH comp, where Elijah doesn't get to play here, which I did find to be a questionable choice. Now, obviously, yes, technically, one of Elijah's noms was still on the block, and this wasn't as radical of a power as a straight up coup d'etat, but I do feel like this twist did upset Elijah's plans enough to where I personally would have let him play in the HOH, though to be fair, again, more than likely would have lost anyway. But again, it ends up being a skills comp that we've seen in the past of them having to slide drinks down a board to get points, and Avery ends up pretty easily winning here in a position where we do see Anthony once again throwing a comp in a position where I do think this is where it started to get a bit overboard in how much Anthony was throwing competitions. It definitely felt like this was a position where he definitely should have been wanting to win. I mean, while it kind of ends up working out for him due to some of his own optimal play later on, I do feel like at this point he really is just putting himself in a hole here and allowing the Spicy V side of things to get a bit too much power, to where he's enabling a power structure that he's not the most benefited by, though realistically, again, he probably wouldn't have won this comp anyway. But anyway, with that, we do have Avery talking about how she wants a chill week and that she's not going to do something crazy. To where, again, up to this point, I did very much look at Avery as the most stable presence within this all-girls alliance, the person who seemed to have the most level head for strategy in the game, until she doesn't. Though here we once again see Anthony wanting to get his way and wanting Todd out, though V, having just built this connection with Todd, decides to not want him out here, in a position where I do think Victoria kind of relied a bit too much on her relationship with Todd, to where a lot of her moves in the upcoming rounds are largely reliant on her wanting to maintain her relationships with Bailey and Todd, in a position where Todd in particular is a number that isn't that integral for her. And to be fair, again, I think that is definitely a credit to Bailey, that Bailey at this point in the game is a pretty influential piece for Victoria, kind of convincing her to stay in line with the all-girl alliance, which, again, under that point of view, having Todd as a number is a pretty important piece on the board. Though the reality is that Victoria had more numbers outside that, to where she didn't actually need Todd. But again, that does bring us to probably one of the biggest strengths in Bailey's game, to where while a lot of it is out of her own lack of awareness of her own game position, the fact that she doesn't know that there are these other grander alliances happening around her, she's still able to convince Victoria that the optimal play is the one that favors her alliance and her point of view within the game, which is something that wasn't the actual point of view that Victoria should have been looking out for. But anyway, because this, Avery does end up deciding to instead target Goose, with using Tola as a pawn, a move that I did find questionable at the time, as it did seem like Goose did have a connection to Avery, and they had previously made a final 2, and it did feel like there was at least that connection there to where it felt unnecessary to go for Goose here, though to be fair, I mean, considering what she later does, that wasn't that optimal move for her either. So again, if she's not going for Todd, I don't know how many real optimal moves there really were for her, but where again, I think the move was probably just to target Tola or target Todd, though she ends up being convinced out of those plans. But we do get a pretty humorous moment from all this of Avery telling Elijah that he's going on the block in a spot where he doesn't seem to recognize that he is the target and thinks that he's the pawn the entire time. And we get also humor from Victoria hiding in the bathroom while this entire conversation is happening. But this does lead to Elijah being surprised by Avery's nomination speech, where she does declare him as the target, to where again he's confused as why is he the target when he's actually loyal to the women here. I mean, yes, obviously he did mess up at the end of the previous week by targeting Victoria, but again, for Avery herself, this plan makes no real sense. But at this point, we do start to get a lot more focus on the Matt and Lexus relationship, with again multiple showman segments that were pretty boring, though it does lead up to Victoria talking about now wanting to get rid of Matt once again. Another pretty questionable move for Victoria here, one that again just upsets her power structure for no real reason. I mean, yes, she is obviously doing so to weaken Anthony's side, but when her relationship with Anthony's already extremely fractured, and Matthew is also someone that is in your alliance and thinks that he's working with you, this again just felt like a completely unnecessary move to make over taking out someone like a Tola. Now, I will say it is definitely better for her game and for Kayla's games than it is for Avery's game. For Avery, again, this makes no sense at all. I can't even think of a real reason why she would want to make this vote go through, though it is through this campaigning that again Avery does land on the correct target of wanting to take out Tola instead. A situation that, what do you know, she can't get to go through as we get to the veto, which ends up being a Philips Sonic Care sponsored challenge of them having to get teeth from gunk and clean them with a toothbrush only to then stack them. A pretty physical comp in a situation where I do think the season did make active strives to make competitions more equitable, and obviously a massive issue we've been seeing recently on BB Can and also BBUS, and obviously was a major letdown of the previous season where we just saw Ty win out just because he was winning a lot of these more physical competitions. So again, for BB Can to actually take strides in making competitions more equal, again, I think that's cool. But this was one of the more physical ones here, where Tola does end up winning the comp here, unsurprisingly, and through so obviously ends up ruining Avery's plans here, and again taking away probably the most optimal option for most of the people on her side. Where at this point, Avery does actually consider using Anthony as a pawn, which is a plan that doesn't really go anywhere, but again would have been an interesting prospect. But really, I mean, at this point, Avery is in a pretty tricky spot. Now again, I think I would have personally said go for Todd. I think Todd is just again a number that she doesn't really need in the game, where Todd is someone that again like is a pretty decent number for Spicy, but not really for many of the other women, to where again I think if I was Avery herself, I do think the move is to put up Todd here, though this is where we do see her finally being convinced to make the move against Matt, again further burning Anthony and Lexus by doing so here, to where by this point they were pretty much out on the Hot Chocolate Alliance. But here we do see Anthony trying to fight back on this plan, to the point where we do see Kayla actually acquiesce, leading to V being annoyed at her for backing down, which all seemed like the first setup on the show to V's lack of trust in Kayla, which had been there since much earlier on in the season, but never felt focused on the show or really as much on the digital dailies either, or never really amounted to anything until obviously the following week, though it is something that I do think Anthony had clearly been putting some work into, clearly trying to plant these seeds in Victoria's head that Kayla's untrustworthy and would eventually go for V, which definitely added to the tension that was going on here, and obviously ends up paying dividends for him down the road. But here we do see Avery deciding to warn Matt that she's considering putting him up, which why? I mean, at this point, you are essentially forcing yourself to put him up, because why let him know that he is a consideration to go up and then not put him up? But also, why even give him the heads up at all, as obviously this just gives him time to campaign for himself, where we do see Anthony giving advice on how to campaign, which again shows the strong suits of Anthony's game, something that wasn't really on the show throughout most of BB Can 7, and really not much up to this point in the season, though at this point we do see a lot of him being this master manipulator in the background, telling people scripts on what to say say, which are most times effective, though here it ends up not being so, and Matt does end up getting backdoored here. Though with that, it does lead us to a pretty interesting vote here, where Matt does have 3 locked-in votes on his side, with him only needing 1 more. And despite a lot of campaigning, it doesn't seem like that vote was ever really that practical. Also, again, we see more questionable play from Victoria here, and her just like outright telling Matt that he has to vote him out because she had alliances before him that she's more loyal to, which is like, why would you say that? Again, this is just giving him ammunition to use against you. But again, we do see some incredulousness from the women talking about how Anthony's upset, but he needs to understand that Todd is Artola. When it's like, okay, but Matt is like his Avery or Kayla. Like, obviously he's going to be upset in this situation. I mean, you're literally targeting his right-hand man, and they're thinking that he should be okay with this. But before we get to the actual eviction itself, we do have to get a segment of Allie and Olivia from BB Can 6 entering the house, which is cool. I really like them. I was happy to see them on the show again. But they're here to promote the Samsung S24 Ultra. And the way to do that is by giving Spicy V pranks through a Spanish to English translator. Why? This was all weird and just felt so dumb. I mean, these missions were not even funny. Again, literally just Victoria hiding water bottles and telling someone where the perfect napping spot is. And all while we're getting these cuts to Allie and Olivia laughing like this is the funniest thing ever. And all this was just so cringy. But either way, we follow that up with the eviction, where it's a 4-3 vote where Matt is evicted here. And straight up, I mean, Matt is probably one of the most forgettable people on this season. I think losing Matt here was definitely not a big loss this season entertainment wise, and also obviously just sparked this further tension between Anthony and Victoria, to where I do think this worked out pretty much for the better here. Again, Matt, really the only thing notable about him is his showmance with Lexus, and even then, it's not that interesting. Where Matt ends up just being a dull personality on the show, even though I don't think he's that bad of a player. I mean, while he is pretty passive in the game, I do think he is very good at building social connections, even though he also did not build enough social connections. But again, he just seems like this purely affable guy, a guy that probably would have done better had the comps of the season been not as equitable as they were, to where he seems like the type of person that is like kind of like Ty, and the fact that he's just going to steamroll competitions if he had the chance, which to be fair, I do think added to his target the assumption that there were going to be comps like that. But because there weren't comps like that on this season, I obviously feel like there wasn't much potential for him on this season. But with that, we then move on to week 6, which does start off with the movie night massacre, a new twist to the game where we get this really over the top BB Can style editing, again showing how much care they put into the execution of their twist, even though this twist does lead to a pretty underwhelming result. Kind of feeling like the opposite of the executive veto, where that had a good result but the twist was bad. This is actually kind of an interesting twist that just had a very bad outcome. But before we get to that, we do get some content here from Todd, who actually seems to start playing the game this week, which is something. Where in the previous week, it seemed like he did some pretty good work in gaining Elijah's loyalty and became Elijah's #1 ally, where here, now we see him starting to build a working relationship with Tola, with us getting only one scene of substance before the massacre begins, which is a conversation between the two where they agree to take a shot at Kayla, being the girl that Todd in particular has the least working relationship with, which I wonder if that's going to matter. Or that we get to the movie night massacre where alarms start sounding and they're told to gather their belongings, where the house is changed into a demented cinema. They're told that one will not escape this carnage, which, why only one? Again, you would think if it's a massacre, you'd think there'll be more than one victim here, but either way. But the twist does start off here with a challenge for safety, an endurance challenge of them having to balance a glass jar on 2 chains while having their head in a glass box where they obviously have bugs and liquids dropped on them. But the challenge placements during this end up being important as they determine the order of the main portion of this twist, which is that based on the placements of them in this challenge, we do see them having to each make a decision, placing another player on a board and give them a role. These roles ranging from HOH to nominees to veto players to a slop pass to having no eviction vote, which again, those latter few just felt like them creating BS things to fill up the board with. But this is a twist that I personally found really fascinating. Now, straight up, it being in placement of a proper round of Big Brother, I mean, is fine for a one-time thing, but I do feel like it does still feel like a radically different game. A game that I would look at as a really fun game as its own separate social strategy game, but this being a game that still involves a lot of need for relationships and alliance building to avoid the block, or being assigned positions of power, and also has this interesting strategy of having to think about what other people down the chain are going to do. and basing your decisions around that. Again, I think there's a lot of fascinating social strategy involved in this game here, though, again, it doesn't feel like Big Brother. It definitely feels like a radically different show, but it was definitely a cool prospect to see this play out here, where Bailey ends up being the first place finisher here, to where we see her have a pretty difficult choice on what exactly to do here, where she could obviously pick one of the nominees or end up picking the HOH. The HOH in this position, not obviously getting to pick the nominees, though obviously does get safety and also gets to pick the replacement nominee in the case of the veto being used, which is obviously somewhat likely to be used considering the fact that only 5 people are competing for the veto. So the HOH is still a pretty powerful position here, and we do see Bailey decide to give the HOH to Victoria, which I think is a solid move. Again, I think at the end of the day, it's very tough to gauge how exactly to play this, as Todd and Tola are next on the board, and you don't really know what they're going to do. But what do you know? We see them nominate Kayla and Avery. Who would have guessed? Again, Kayla as their target, Avery as their pawn, as they think Avery's the only person that would stay against Kayla, to where, again, this is a pretty big move being made here, a move that felt like this massive shift in the power structure, with it looking like we were headed towards a hot chocolate steamroll. Yet this finally puts the Victoria side of things in a bit of danger here. Though beyond that, we do get some interesting strategy around who gets played in the veto, with Anthony picking Goose to get no eviction vote, as he doesn't think Goose will win the veto and wants to make it more likely that Kayla and Avery stay on the block. While also Lexus ends up picking Tola, as she thought he was the most likely to win the veto. Though by the end of the chain, it didn't end up being as interesting, just because Victoria ends up picking Anthony for a slot pass, which essentially means that the other 2 picks are automatic, as they have to be given to people playing in the veto, which kind of made this kind of go out in a little bit of a whimper there. But again, this did feel like this big shakeup in the power structure, with a lot of the house working against Victoria's wishes for the first time, leading up to the veto, where the comp itself ends up being kind of boring, of them having to drink drinks to find a combination that opens up a puzzle, and all this was kind of rushed on the show. But Kayla ends up winning the veto here, obviously completely upsetting the initial plan. And what do you know, we get to be continued, which was lame. I mean, a cliffhanger here was just kind of dumb. It was kind of here to overshadow how underwhelming of a result this twist ended up being, with us even getting a next time on here that very much implied that Anthony was going to be in danger, yet all that really amounts to nothing. And I feel like this could have been a position where they could have easily fit all this into one episode. Again, all this is wrapped up pretty quickly in the following episode, and when mixing that in with the fact that we have to see every single player read out the rules and see their reactions to things, and also see them getting jump scared along the way, it's like, again, definitely felt like they did waste a lot of time here into bloating out the episode in a position where this cliffhanger just felt completely unnecessary. But with that, Victoria now has to decide on who the replacement nom is, to where we do see Todd and Tola obviously being exposed for putting up Kayla and Avery, to which they decide to lie and say that their plan all along was the backdoor Goose. Because you would have the backdoor Goose? But what's funny is that this does actually lead to Victoria deciding to put up Goose, telling him that he's the pawn, which is like, why would he believe that? And also, again, just kind of bad jury management there, where Goose does end up being the first juror here. But again, Goose does fight back, and again, in what was implied to be a campaign against Anthony in the previous episode, it's actually a campaign against Tola, which doesn't go through, even though we do see the other women actually wanting Tola to go on the block. But Victoria obviously is trying to play both sides in this instance. Goose goes on the block, and we do have a pretty big opportunity here for actually Anthony's side to make a pretty big move in voting out Avery, again really upsetting Victoria's power structure. And we do see Goose do a pretty decent campaign here, though it never felt like everything lined up here. They probably just didn't have enough time to coordinate, and even then I don't know if Anthony would have been on board with making the move at this point. But this does lead to Elijah being voted out unanimously, which was again a pretty underwhelming outcome to this big twist. Again, a twist with this much gravitas put into it, just leading to Elijah getting voted out is kind of lame. But we do get some intrigue on his way out, though, where he does go up to Kayla and tell her that no one will beat Spicy V if she gets to the end. Some information that causes some drama later in the week, though. Overall, again, I think the TV product of this twist was interesting, though I think this twist really just played out in the worst possible way. Again, having an underwhelming outcome in Elijah going out, but even beyond that, it really just sapped a lot of the momentum that this season was having. It really just lessened my personal excitement for the show, where because of this twist and how much they dragged it out, that meant that we essentially got no digital dailies for almost a week. Because again, they're scared of spoiling their own show when they themselves accidentally spoiled the result the morning of the Eviction episode, which made all this just so stupid. But anyway, we do lose Elijah here, who, I mean, had a couple funny moments here and there, largely from him getting frustrated at points. But as a whole, Elijah was kind of a frustrating player on the season. I mean, one that just seemed kind of aloof to what was going on in the game. Again, was with the Directors Alliance, but again, that was never really a true alliance. And considering him being this big super fan, one that I was definitely expecting to come into this and play this Kevin Jacobs style game, he really ends up doing none of that and ends up just kind of being a bit of a doofus on this season, to where, well, again, I don't have anything against him. From a personal standpoint, he seems like a purely affable guy. I just don't feel like he's someone that played Big Brother that well, and just was kind of snowed by Victoria for most of his run this season, to where while he was closer to Victoria and working with her for a lot of the season, she never cared at all about him, to where at the end of the day, I do feel like Elijah just ended up being kind of a frustrating player on this season. But with that, we get to the rest of week 6, where right before the HOH comp, we get content about Avery being pissed that Todd put her on the block and says that Todd and Tola are her nominees if she wins. And what do you know? She wins HOH. In what is another pretty equitable comp here of them just having to solve puzzles in 1v1 matchups, to where Todd and Tola end up being the first ones drawn here, which again, I already showed you how screwed they were going to be, especially when they themselves struggled with the puzzle to the point where they took 27 minutes for their specific round. But again, Avery just dominates this challenge and ends up winning here. And we really don't get much time before the actual nominations, to where, again, because this is a shortened week, we just really skim through to her putting Todd and Tola on the block. Though with that, we do also get another cliffhanger on the Tuesday night episode here. This time right before the Veto comp, which has us seeing a ridiculous number of plans going on here, really showing that there was so much going on during this week that we just simply had to rush through. And obviously the cliffhanger here was to add suspense on, oh, which of these plans is going to go through, which, to be honest, I was surprised any of them did, where I just thought it was going to lead to a pretty boring result. But anyway, initially we do see Bailey wanting to target Tola here, with her talking about her plans of winning the veto to take Todd off the block, so I wonder what's going to happen there. But with that, we then cut to Kayla talking to Lexus, telling her that she thinks that they should target Bailey, thinking that Bailey is on to the Hot Chocolate Alliance and needs to go because of that, which does show Kayla, again, as a pretty loyal number to Hot Chocolate. I think probably being one of the only people in the house at this point actually being loyal to Hot Chocolate, which is kind of humorous considering what ends up happening to her this week. But again, it makes you think initially that, oh, maybe Bailey is going home here. That is, until we see Todd go to Bailey and tell her that Lexus was in on the plan to potentially flip the vote onto Kayla, onto Avery, leading to Bailey telling the other women about this, to where now they all agree to target Lexus, which I will say, in this position, why are you believing Todd? Or, I mean, really, again, it just further shows that they just simply don't trust Lexus to begin with. But again, like, Todd is someone that's clearly on the bottom and on his way out, to where why are you trusting his information in this instance? But with that, now we see Avery planning on backdooring Lexus, but that's not where this all ends, as we do get the episode ending on a conversation between Victoria and Anthony, with Victoria telling Anthony that Lexus is now the target, obviously something that he is clearly not on board with, leading to Anthony revealing that he has some info in his back pocket, revealing what Elijah told to Kayla, which I guess for some reason she had been constantly telling other people in the house this information, that Spicy V is the biggest threat in the game, yet did not tell Spicy V this information, which obviously does come off very sus from V's perspective, and obviously just came off as extremely sloppy play, to which we again see Anthony taking advantage of this information, really effectively using it to fully convince V to turn against Kayla, thinking that Kayla is coming for her, to which this is when the plan now turns to backdooring Kayla, which again we do see end up going through, which I think is probably one of the most impressive plays Anthony does on this season. I mean, one where it does feel like this long con that he had putting in work to make go through for weeks here, and trying to make V suspicious of Kayla, but now cashing all that in a move to save Lexus, someone that's obviously a very integral number for his power structure, and by taking Kayla, really upsetting V's power structure. And again, a really impressive play to see him pull off here, though obviously it's used as the cliffhanger here, to where again it made me think it wasn't going to go through, though again it did, so that's cool. And again, we get more follow-up on this in the following episode, where we see Anthony telling Lexus the plan to backdoor her, and again, giving her the exact thing to say to Spicy V, essentially mixing the Elijah information with lies that Kayla implied that she's coming for V and Avery, to give Spicy more ammunition, allowing Spicy to turn Avery against Kayla, which again makes absolutely no sense for Avery's game. Again, her second HOH, and the second time she's taking out a number that is on her side. This one even more egregious, though, where again, at least with the Matt situation, I can at least understand it to a slight degree of Matt not being a core number for her, Matt being a person that is more attached to Anthony. Here, this is just outright stupidity. This makes absolutely no sense for Avery to be getting rid of Kayla. Even in a position where she thinks that Kayla is coming after her, there's still other people that she knows are coming after her, and Todd and Tola. Like, none of this actually makes sense for Avery's game, and again, completely sinks her game in the following round, with her having no real leg to stand on by that point. Though also with that, I will also say again, as I mentioned with Todd, why are you listening to Todd's information? Why are you listening to Lexus's information here? This also makes no sense. And again, you know that you were targeting Lexus, which again, you know that Anthony found out that information, and through that you would assume that Anthony would try to save Lexus. So again, you should not be taking this information credibly. Yet for some reason, Avery says that, oh, I'm listening to it because they were brave enough to tell me what was going on, when it's like, no, they're just lying to you. But either way, it also leads up to this pretty funny moment of Avery asking Tola if Kayla ever said anything to him, leading to Tola just stumbling over his words, and Avery saying to him, take your time, it's better if you're honest, aka you're giving him time to make up a lie, only for Tola to then proceed to say, I don't think she has, only for him to go talk to Anthony, and Anthony being annoyed at him, and again just giving him an outright script to say to her, to which he does, and she again for some reason believes it at that point, fully thinking that Kayla said that she's going to be targeting people that have won HOHs. Oh, while we then see them use Kayla's Bailey backdoor plan to convince Bailey to get on board this, to where all this was just kind of sad to see Kayla getting so dunked on here, to where we get to the veto ceremony where Bailey uses the veto on Todd and Kayla is backdoored, where she's confused and supposedly actually thought that she was the pawn when she first went up, despite not being warned about going on a block, which makes you think that why would they do that? But obviously realizes eventually that she is the target, to where we do see Avery laying out all the supposed information, to where again you just feel bad for Kayla here, really trying to tell the truth here, again admitting to what she did say, but while also promising that the lies are lies, only for no one to end up believing her. To where we do get this house meeting here, which ends up leading to a lot of bickering here between her and the other players, of her being called out for all the things she said and some that she didn't say. But again, it was tough to see her like not be able to fully back herself here, as it's in a position where the only way that she can explain her actions to Bailey are to rat out the Hot Chocolate Alliance, though to stay in the house, she also needs the Hot Chocolate Alliance. So again, she gets berated on by Bailey in this instance, in a position where she can't really fight back or completely sink her chances of staying in the game. But to be fair, I mean, Kayla does kind of just give up by the end of the week, where we do see on digital dailies on the final day, she just doesn't bother campaigning at that point and kind of seems resigned to the fact that she's going home, to where we do see her eventually get taken out in a unanimous vote. To where, again, I really like Kayla on this season. While I do think she is a mixed bag of a player, again, some of that does seem very well rounded in most aspects of the game, but also that's a bit of a mess strategically. Again, I don't agree with a lot of her strategic decision making. I also feel like, again, while she is very good at building specific one-on-one bonds, I do think she doesn't really reach out enough to people outside of her core group. Though again, I think she is a pretty well-rounded player. I think she's someone that, again, brought good TV at points on this season, definitely more so than someone like Lexus, who I would say is in a similar archetype. So Kayla is someone that I wouldn't be opposed to seeing back down the road. Again, I think there's a lot of potential there with Kayla, but on this season, we don't see it get fully lived up to. But with that, we then finally get to week 7, which ends up being one of the slower weeks of the season, to where the result of this week is pretty straightforward from the very beginning, but the HOH here ends up being an endurance comp of them having to balance a ball on a bow using cables attached to their hips, where we see them wearing 80s workout outfits, which were ridiculous, with us seeing Todd being given one that doesn't even fit him and them just mocking him for some reason. But this does lead to a funny moment of V wanting to be the first out of the competition, though really ends up hamming it up here, to where Anthony calls her out for it in the DR. But either way, Tola ends up winning the HOH here, making it pretty clear that he's just gonna target Avery. And again, it was a pretty boring week outside that. But to go along with this HOH win, Tola also gets a secret award from Infinity, that being a strategy session with Kevin Jacobs, which was random. Again, literally seeing them having a strategy session in a car, which I will say I haven't talked about up to this point, but there literally was a car in the house itself that people were using to have strategy talks, which again was just kind of a funny little aspect of this season. But I did find the strategy session here kind of awkward, as I do think Kevin was giving pretty good advice, though I think it's pretty clear Tola didn't take any of this into account and just seemed like a lot of it was going over his head. But again, at the end of the day, I think Tola was just going to do the same thing anyway. Again, he obviously targets Avery here, with her not really having anything she could do to really change that, though we do get some talk about possible Victoria backdoor that never seemed like an actual possibility this week, with Anthony seeming to more so propose this just as setup for trying to get Tola to turn on Victoria down the road. But again, it seemed like something that was at least considered. But But through this, we do also get a lot of focus on the Anthony and Bailey relationship for the first time, where for a lot of the season they had a pretty rocky relationship, but it had been growing over the last few weeks to where he does say that Bailey is a higher priority to him than hot chocolate, which, again, kind of came out of nowhere on the show, and mixing that with the fact that Bailey also seemed to be kind of clocking Anthony's game constantly, to where she seems to be aware of his manipulation tactics and how effective he is in the game, to where this did start to portray Bailey as a more formidable foe for Anthony down the road, even though, again, she also didn't plan on taking him out anytime soon. But again, through that, at this point in the game, I think Bailey's in a pretty strong spot. Again, being in an endgame position to where she has so many pretty close bonds in the endgame here. Again, having connections to Anthony, having connections to Victoria, also still having Todd in the game. To where, well, again, I think Bailey's game is kind of up and down throughout this season. I think this is a spot in the season where, through the move being made on Kayla and Anthony's side also being weakened along the way, again, actually puts her in a pretty decent spot towards the end game here. But with that, we do see Tola nominating Avery, obviously, with Bailey as the pawn, with Tola saying to Bailey that he is stronger, faster, and better looking than her, which was all clearly a joke that Bailey doesn't take as a joke and is really pissed for some reason, which I will say was not a good look for Bailey here. Again, while it did add to some drama for TV, I do think it really just made Bailey come off as pretty petulant here, again, showing her proceed to make personal jabs at him, calling him air again, and a small man, calling him a toddler, when, again, I feel like she was the one acting like a toddler. And again, this is just so over the top, to the point where I thought she was joking, but no, it seems like she was genuinely upset from all this, to where I just simply didn't understand why. But at this point, we do see V trying to campaign for Todd to go on the block, which ends up being pretty ineffective here, where it just comes off as her trying to save herself and trying to keep herself off the block while also trying to save Avery, and everyone really clocking what she's doing here, where it is funny that at the same time we see Bailey telling Todd to try to win the veto and then proceed to not use it, which, I mean, would keep her on the block, which is a little bit questionable, but also all that making V's campaigning for not, where we do get to the veto competition, which is an ND sponsor challenge to where they have to compete from their bed. Again, another equitable comp of them just counting stars and getting temptations along the way, to where they can bid for the amount of time that they have to wear a sleep mask, which would obviously mess up their account. To where we do see V saying that she can't win this comp as using the veto would piss off Anthony, so she decides to throw it, taking a temptation for a phone call from home, saying that she doesn't think Todd can count and doesn't think Anthony will win, all while we do see Anthony actually trying in this competition for once, until he gets a $5,000 temptation. Though it did seem like he was actually in the lead for most of the comp, but again, he ends up giving it up at the end, allowing Todd to win the veto here, with him clearly not using it. And again, there's really no suspense towards the end of the week, to where we actually waste a lot of time on the double eviction episode on Avery's campaign, when again, none of it mattered, where we do see Anthony and Lexus end up being the decision makers here, and they really never sway from voting out Avery here, to where we also even see her campaign to Tola, who again only votes in a tie, and all this just did not matter. Avery was clearly going home, with V voting to keep her here, which felt a bit cute. I mean, definitely unnecessary to me. Again, obviously it is jury management, though I think Avery was going to vote for Victoria anyway, and all this does is open up the potential of upsetting Bailey. So again, all this was just kind of unnecessary. But on her way out, we do see Avery being very self-congratulatory, saying in her speech that she was the best player in the house and that that's why she's on the block. And after she's evicted, she said that she played such a great game that her own alliance was scared of her, which that means that you didn't play that great of a game then, as if you did, your alliance wouldn't turn against you this early. But anyway, we lose Avery, who, again, was my initial winner pick. I mean, technically, I did change it to Anthony after the premiere, but anyway, Avery is someone that kind of played exactly like I thought she would be. Again, I got very much Casey from BB20 vibes in the preseason. I think she's exactly that. A very competent player all around, one that, again, good at comps, pretty good socially, has a level-headed strategic mind, though, again, I think she kind of just gives up her game for Victoria, where, again, I think she's essentially Casey if Tyler was a more unstable presence in the game, to where here we do see Victoria really stir her in the wrong direction, making her make moves that are not in her best interest, and convincing her to take out her own numbers. So where, again, I think Avery is someone that definitely has potential in the game, though, again, just plays the game in a way that she's just being told what to do by people that are more strategically active around her, to where, again, outside of that, again, I think she's a somewhat competent player, but when that was another kind of frustrating player to watch on this season, with her ending up making some suboptimal moves for her game. But with that, this week's not done yet, as we do get to the double eviction. which ends up being largely lackluster. Though let's start with Arissa faking them out here and saying that we've never done an eviction where we send 4 people home in one night. Only to say, and tonight we're not doing that, which again was a pretty funny moment there. And the HOH here ends up being a bizarre comp here of them having to add up bib numbers of everyone running around, and they're close to the answers, HOH, and the runners themselves here are BB Can alumni, which, fine. I mean, again, would rather have these people back for a returnee season, but again, for a short cameo, fine. Even though, again, there's also like one random challenge producer that's there, which is like, why was this person here? Especially when straight up this comp was pretty terrible for TV. Or again, kind of shows him not being that good at his job in this instance. As again, you can't really even tell what's going on here. Again, like people are just running around. You can't play along. You're not seeing all the numbers properly. And we're just literally seeing other people seeing people run around. But anyway, we get to the result where Victoria ends up winning the comp, despite trying to throw it and literally answering 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's something. But it's funny that through Victoria accidentally winning this, she actually puts herself in a pretty strong position moving forward, where again, this allows her to take another shot at the Anthony side of things, which puts her at a numbers advantage coming to the following round, where obviously she ends up targeting Tola here. But we do get some debate on who the other nominee should be, to where we once again see Bailey do some pretty good work in these quick situations here of instantly going to Victoria and telling her to put up Lexus, don't do Todd, to where we see her just openly telling her that Anthony and Lexus would vote out Todd if he's on the block right in front of them, leading to Victoria putting up Lexus as a pawn, despite having previously promised her safety earlier in the week. So we get to the veto comp, which again was another competition, not particularly good for TV. The one I think is actually kind of would be a fun one to actually play, one where they're all given this like table maze of 250 balls, and they have to get all the balls in the hole. The quickest one to do so wins. Again, a kind of interesting comp there. Again, another equitable one, but again, one that did not make for good TV, and one that was very hard to follow who exactly was in the lead. But Todd ends up winning the comp here, which just opens up this possibility of him making a pretty big move here, and him maybe being able to take off Tola, someone he had a close working relationship with, and maybe blindside Anthony, but no, he doesn't use it. And what do you know, Tola goes out unceremoniously here, which again was just a very lackluster double. But with that, again, we lose Tola, who again was an alternate on this season, and I think by watching this season you can kind of tell why. I don't think Tola was the most riveting TV in the world. I think he was kind of a dull personality. Now again, he had a very touching backstory, at least that's something, but as a TV personality on the show itself, again, I don't think he really brought much to the table. He was kind of just a lackey for Anthony throughout a lot of this season, and while again, he did start to play independently at points, particularly in him trying to target Kayla, it really did not amount to much, to where really I just kind of look at him as a bit of a dodo figure for this season, where while he did win some comps towards the very end, I don't think he had really much potential in the game, despite again, a lot of talk about how, oh, he's a big threat in the game, but again, it didn't really feel like the jury really reciprocated that, to where I don't think he had much potential in the grand scheme of things. But now for week 8, the final 5 round, which ends up probably being the best week of the entire season, especially from the sheer quality of the television product, though we do start off with the reaction to the double, during which we do see Victoria starting to be completely sunk by the edit, with the show finally portraying Victoria's moves as detrimental for her own game, something that really she's been doing for the entire season, but it really feels like this is the point where it really turned on her, with her obviously being on her way out at this point, which made it pretty clear that this upcoming plan against Victoria was going to go through, which made it pretty clear that was the reason why they stopped protecting her in the edit. The first thing that goes wrong for her is that we do see Bailey admitting to Victoria that her vote for Avery did upset her, saying that she's uncomfortable of anyone saying her name, which does lead to Bailey again realizing just how unfaithful Victoria had been to her throughout a lot of this game, which mixing that into the fact that Victoria also threw the previous veto competition, like it really just makes a laundry list of reasons why Bailey ends up losing trust with Victoria across this week. While we have Anthony also being very upset at Victoria in this instance for getting rid of Tola, with him being extremely emotional and saying that nothing he could do could save his brother, and he will never forgive Spicy for this, which might seem very melodramatic at first, though again, I think when looking at this in the perspective, again, Anthony having just lost his best friend right before the season, and this giving him flashbacks to that, I do think this makes this a really sympathetic moment for him. But also here, we do get some tension between Spicy and Lexus. First, in Lexus calling out V for not wanting to get rid of Todd during the double eviction over Tola, in an instance where, again, Victoria the previous week had been constantly campaigning against Todd in an attempt to save Avery, yet now all of a sudden she doesn't care to get rid rid of Todd, which obviously shows how manipulative she was trying to be there. But with that, we do get this very awkward moment of V trying to apologize for Lexus, only for Lexus to clearly be annoyed still, and proceeds to then try to change rooms, only for V to just outwardly tell her that you're lucky you're still in this damn house, which I get all this very strange content and really poor play from both of them. But anyway, we get to the HOH comp, which ends up being Nepo Babies, a Q&A on answering questions of who said this in their previous speeches, though their voices are babified, because obviously, I guess. But it ends up coming down to a tie between Bailey and Anthony, with Anthony actually pulling out this HOH, during which we get a great reaction from him saying that it's time to get cocky in this bitch, and I'm tired of being humble, which obviously is exactly what Anthony is known for. But realistically, I mean, this ends up being a pretty bad HOH for him to win, to where while he obviously has a set agenda and does end up getting that through, I do feel like just the notion of having to win Final 5 HOH is not a great position to be in, especially when you don't have your end game completely locked up. But Anthony does right away say that his ideal plan for the week is to take out Spicy, but says that he needs to do it through backdooring her. Which, I mean, to be fair, again, yeah, I understand in the sense that obviously you don't want to alert Spicy to the fact that she is going home. Obviously, they'll give her a lot of time to campaign against you and give her a chance to upset your plans. But again, when literally the entire house is involved in this plan, I do think it leaves it open, obviously, for this plan to leak anyway. But that does lead to probably the most impressive aspect of this week from a gameplay perspective from Anthony, and the fact that he does say in this moment that he needs to dig deep into the minds of her closest allies and turn them against her, to which he somehow actually does. Where we do see him first taking Victoria to Wendy's, saying that he does so that she'll open up and give him dirt that he will use against her, to where during which we see her actively campaigning against Todd and wanting Todd to go, allowing Anthony to go to Todd and tell him exactly what she said about him, only to then go to also Bailey and leak to her that Victoria hadn't been protecting her until very recently, and constantly throw her under the bus, fully turning Bailey and Todd against V, to where again, at this point, it became this entire house operation in trying to get Victoria on the block. And all in all, again, a very impressive move for Anthony to pull off. Again, this big blindside Spicy V, who had so much social capital for so much of this season. However, I do think there are some question marks on whether or not this is the move to make, where obviously Spicy V is someone that, again, would later fully claim that she'll take Anthony to the end, and through that, obviously, she's someone that might be better for his positioning in the game, though at the same time, Spicy V is also someone that would very blatantly beat him if he got to the end with her, to where, again, I think there are pros and cons with the concept of keeping Spicy, though I think on paper, really, my initial thought here is that I think his ideal target would just to be targeting Bailey, where Bailey is someone that obviously has a connection to Todd, where they're a duo in the game, obviously very likely to take each other further in the game, though I do think, considering the lack of trust that Anthony clearly has for V at this point, with him very clearly also very much trusting Bailey much more than he does V. And again, the fact that he would lose against V at the end, he has more of a working relationship with Bailey at this point in the game. I do get why he makes this choice. Though again, obviously Bailey's someone that had a lot of win equity as well, and obviously had Todd in the game, to where again, I do think it's a dangerous position either way. I think Anthony was in a very tough decision no matter which choice he made here. And while I don't disagree with his target of Victoria at this point in the game, I do think I personally would have still went for Bailey instead. But just the concept of the move itself is something I'm not fully against here. But this does lead to Anthony obviously going to Bailey and telling her of his plan that being of putting her on the block as a pawn against Todd, to which Bailey instantly freaks out here, saying that you are not putting me on the block, which does end up shifting Anthony's mind here, which I did see some people talk about how this is Bailey tricking Anthony into keeping her off the block, when it's not really her tricking him, it's just her being honest and saying that if we are supposed to be this duo in the game, as Anthony claims, and if we are also supposed to be fully protecting each other in the game, then why are you putting me on the block? And obviously there are reasons for this, but with Bailey being a pretty emotional thinker at points, again, someone that definitely is very reactionary to just the mere mention of someone saying her name or talking about putting her on the block. At the end of the day, I do think it makes sense for Anthony to not go through this nomination here. Though really, I think this is something he probably should have concepted before he told Bailey, to where obviously this leads to Bailey knowing that he would be willing to put her up initially. But again, with this, we do see him instead decide to put up Lexus on the block as a pawn, a move that he's able to convince Lexus of. Again, everyone in the house was involved in what was going on at this point. But I think this is the part of the week that for me was the most questionable. I do think it is definitely a very precarious position here to be nominating Lexus, in a position where Lexus is Anthony's most loyal ally at this point in the game, and also just an integral number for Anthony's endgame, to where risking Lexus on the block here in a position where Todd and Bailey would have all the power in deciding who goes home is a very difficult position to be putting yourself in. Or again, while he is able to do really effective work alongside Alexis in making sure this flip doesn't happen, the fact that they're even risking this to begin with, again, does feel questionable. Though, again, considering how prone Bailey is to, again, flipping at the first instance of anyone mentioning her name, I do think this was the right call to be maintaining Bailey's loyalty for down the road, which is integral if he does want to take Spicy out. Though I think it's at that point where I would question, like, why not just blindside Spicy outright? For obviously, yes, you don't want her fully playing to her best ability in the veto, but I do think that's more of a risk worth taking than really leaving Lexus wide open to be taken out by Bailey and Todd, or even just outright pissing Bailey off. But anyway, nominations go through of it being Lexus and Todd, with V gloating on her own about how she's never hit the block. It's almost like this is her HOH, which obviously ends up being really ironic by the end. But again, it is at this point where I do think Anthony and Lexus do really effective work keeping Bailey and Todd on their side, with them constantly ratting Victoria out to them whenever they would have a conversation with them, keeping them informed on every little conversation they would have with her. To where with Victoria continuing to sink herself as the week goes along and trying to play all sides, and them just openly comparing notes at every opportunity, it really leads to this plan solidifying, despite the fact that I do think this is actually also pretty questionable for Bailey. I do think for Bailey, letting go of V here over Lexus in particular is a move that really makes no real sense for her, where again, considering the plan that ends up playing out, she has full control over this vote and very easily could have taken Lexus out of the game, which in doing so would have essentially locked in a position for her at the end where she's a very likely winner, while keeping Lexus in the game is keeping a person that is good at comps and also someone that doesn't want to take you to the end. To where I do think for Bailey herself, I think the move of keeping Lexus in the game here was very questionable, even though the actual flip itself never felt like a practicality because of how well Anthony and Lexus played this round, along with the fact that Victoria obviously sank her own game. But anyway, we get to the veto comp, which ends up being a pretty good one here. It being a series of 3 like mini challenges. For once you finish these challenges, you then have this like crapshoot section at the end of you having to guess which tube leads to the veto, and if you're wrong, you have to go back and do all the challenges again. Again, a really cool comp here. I actually really enjoyed this one. Kind of feels like this perfect mix of what I personally want from Big Brother competitions, and it being pretty equitable while also still having the physical components that, again, a lot of the other side of the fan base really wants. To where, while obviously physicality can definitely benefit you in this challenge, it's one where it only goes so far. It only allows you to have more opportunities at getting the veto, but doesn't really guarantee you the veto, which is something that I did actually kind of like out of this challenge. But by the end of the challenge, Todd ends up winning his 3rd veto of the season, fully allowing this plan to go through now, to where by the time of the veto ceremony, we do have Victoria very clearly being suspicious, as Bailey, obviously someone that should be very much panicking at this point, is someone that is acting very carefree, to where we do see her confronting Anthony, to where Anthony ends up revealing to her all the things that other people have said to him, with his justification for this move here being that V wasn't loyal to the soil and that she had been sinking his name, which, I mean, she had been, though she continuously denies it here. And we do see a lot of scrambling from her right before the veto, with her begging Anthony to believe her that she had always been loyal to him and always wanted to go to Final 2 with him and never told anyone else to target him, which again is a complete lie, but V seemed to genuinely believe her lies here. To where, again, I think this is a very difficult situation here, a situation where, again, Anthony knows that she's lying, the other players know that she's lying. However, Victoria herself is so resolute here in the fact that she isn't lying when she is. was leading to her feeling like she's being unjustly taken out of the game, when it very much is just the ramifications of her own actions. But through her own inability to accept her own faults in her game, it does lead to her becoming increasingly bitter as this week goes along. But all this is a really great series of events here, with Anthony fully laying out to V why she's going on the block, only for her to clearly be heartbroken here. All of her begging comes off as really ineffective here, though it does lead to Anthony leaving the conversation, walking over to Bailey and wanting her to reconfirm the conversations that her and V had, to which on the show we get a cliffhanger. For some reason, I guess they just felt like they couldn't fit everything in, but again, this was pretty pointless, as we literally get to the next episode where this conversation ends up leading to nothing. And we then get to the veto ceremony, where even then we see Victoria still begging on her way there, which I do at least respect from Victoria in that light. And the fact that, again, up to the nomination itself, again, at least she continued to try. But obviously she ends up being the renom here, to where we see her walk away without talking to anybody else, to where she says how messed up this is that Anthony's HOH is the one that takes her out, and says that he's using this info to get rid of her because she's a good competitor and he had to take the shot before it's too late, and becomes increasingly annoyed at how he won't admit to this, which, to be fair, I do think this is actually what Anthony should be saying. I do think for Anthony, while again, I think his actual justification for this is what he is saying. I do think he fully believes that the reason why he is making this move is because of how unloyal Victoria was to him. I don't think that's the way you sell it here. Now, in reality, I do think Victoria was probably going to be bitter anyway, and I think was always going to be upset at whatever justification Anthony tried to create. However, I do feel like the optimal strat here is still to play this off as if Victoria was just too big of a threat for you to take to the end and you couldn't beat her, along with, again, this very easy opportunity to connect this to your previous season, where, again, this was a very similar situation to what Anthony had with Dane at the final 5 in that season, where he had Dane's fate in his hands and ended up saving him there. I think he could have used that as this great parallel here to try to sympathize with Victoria in this situation, though obviously he just ends up kind of blowing that opportunity. But with that, we don't really get any focus on the show itself of Victoria's campaign, which was kind of interesting, as obviously BB Can likes to focus a lot on these boring campaigns that don't matter, and obviously Victoria's was really ineffective also. But I will say Victoria's campaigning was pretty terrible here. It was very messy, with her being in this position where she should be fully focusing on just solely Bailey and Todd, as Bailey and Todd are really the only numbers she needs. They're the only people voting here. They are the people that can clearly save her. Again, she has this really ripe campaign that she could have used to take out Lexus, as again, I think it is the optimal move for Bailey to do so. However, she just simply doesn't. Instead, puts a lot more of her focus onto Anthony in a position where, again, Anthony can only vote in the event of a tie. And while theoretically, again, Anthony could have switched his mind and gotten Bailey and Todd to vote out Lexus, again, that's not a particularly likely situation. But also, even beyond that, she spends a lot of time trying to justify herself to Lexus as well, which in essence just gives Lexus more ammunition to use against her, which all that was so bad. But again, the show itself thankfully focuses a lot more on the drama of it all, which was really fun for the most part. And we do start off with a skip the dishes segment, which should have been really bad, but the thing that was really funny about it is the fact that while everyone is celebrating about the food, we have Victoria in the background clearly being annoyed. Here we get this funny moment of everyone saying these sentimental comments about their experience, only for V to be asked to say something and her to just say no. But again, this leads us to a series of arguments between Anthony and Victoria on her way out. So we do get an initial argument that has Lexus and Bailey listening into their conversation, and it is funny how at this point she is just very openly talking about how her real alliance was always with Anthony and that she was always pretending to be close to the others in favor of her alliance with Anthony, which is okay, you're saying this in a position where, yeah, maybe in a world this would convince Anthony to keep you, but this is just further sinking your chances of getting Bailey and Todd to keep, to where you're essentially openly admitting to them that your relationship with them is fake, so why would they want to keep you at that point? But anyway, we then get another fight between V and Anthony in the HOH room, with her continuing to give the same spiel. They again clearly not working on Anthony, leading to her smashing a glass as she leaves, with this fight really accelerating to the point where V ends up telling the others that her and Anthony had a final 2 since day 1, with Anthony full out just yelling at V at this instance, which was just so surreal to see. Again, knowing Anthony, seeing his run on BB Can 7, where like a major talking point there was Anthony's awareness of how he could be perceived. Obviously the stereotypes that are there with his background and how he would like sit on the ground and obviously just try to avoid getting into confrontations to try to not play into that stereotype. And for him to actually be at this point where he's yelling at Spicy, again, this really shows you just how genuinely upset he is in this instance, as again, this is exactly what he didn't want to do. Though this does all lead up to a pretty humorous moment though, where Bailey goes in to check up on Anthony after the fight, to Victoria then entering the HOH room with a broom and just sweeps up the glass without talking, clearly being told by production that she has to clean this up, which all that was a funny moment. But again, we lead up to the actual vote itself, where a really great speech from Victoria on her way out. Again, super bitter obviously, but her talking about how she's proud of everybody but Anthony, and then openly says to everybody that he turned his back against the Hot Chocolate and Big Bucks Alliance, which I will say, this is a part of the speech that I did not particularly love. I do feel like this is her clearly taking more personal jabs at Anthony at this point, where obviously the Big Bucks Alliance is named after his friend that just passed away, and it feels like she's kind of using his name to take a dig at him here, along with the fact that, again, by bringing up Hot Chocolate, which was an alliance that was initially made around race, I feel like she's also trying to use that against him in this instance, which again, I thought was a pretty bad look. But she does also say here that if you want to win this game, you have to take out the trash, and points to Anthony, which in that instance, again, I do think this is a somewhat effective usage of putting a target on someone as you leave, where again, most times people just end up saying that the person that they hate won't win and won't get their jury vote, which in essence essentially just makes it more likely people take him to the end. Well, obviously this is an instance where she's saying that to win you have to take him out of the game, so again, it's a little bit better. But again, Victoria gets voted out unanimously here, with her being clearly bitter on her way out, of her hugging everybody but Anthony, and again, clearly coming off hypocritical in her exit interviews, to where it felt like there's no real mending to that relationship. But again, with that, we do lose Spicy V, who was a massive character on this season. I mean, Spicy V was pretty much the main character of a lot of this season. Again, Spicy V was all over pretty much everything this season entailed. Again, she was in this dominant position for really the entire game, which makes it more frustrating at the game that she ended up playing on this season. The fact that, again, she should have been in this position where she could have run the game from beginning to end unfettered. She had such a strong power structure around her that she could have just easily held together and ran the entire show, but then she just doesn't. She sabotaged her own game constantly, taking out her own numbers, ruining relationships with her own alliance members, and she gets to a final 5 where most of her super solid numbers are gone, and she simply just runs out of runway. And again, I think Victoria plays a pretty terrible dominant game on this season. It's a situation where, again, I think she was kind of handed a majority alliance. I think she was someone that, while again, there is definitely social credit to give to her, the fact that she was able to still maintain a lot of relationships in the game, I think the way that she utilized that alliance in this season is so terrible. So really, I feel like this is absolute best case scenario for Spicy V. I think this season was essentially giving her a win on the silver platter and her just messing it up for herself, which is pretty much just how most seasons are going to go with Spicy V. Now again, despite all these criticisms of her game, I think she's an incredible TV character. I think she's probably up there as one of the best Big Brother Canada characters of all time, with her having this really fun energy and obviously a very chaotic gameplay style that makes for fantastic TV, even though I don't think she's that great of a player in the grand scheme of things. And then we get to the final 4 round, where we do spend a lot of time in the episode seeing the reactions to V's final words, with Bailey being upset at Anthony for having been in alliances that he never told her about, leading to some initial awkwardness, with Anthony just remaining silent when asked about it, clearly being pissed at what just happened. Though later we do get some pretty sloppy play from him, with him revealing to her the people that were in the Hot Chocolate Alliance, but leaving out Lexus, obviously to not make Bailey aware of how close he is to Lexus, only for him to mention V going for Lexus as being one of the main reasons why he turned against it. With all this really seeming to make Bailey fully aware of the game that was happening around her for most of this game, but also making her pretty aware of Anthony's game at this point, realizing that he obviously wants Todd out at this point, as he assumes that both her and Lexus would take him to 2, to where she does end up talking about how big of a threat he is, and that she needs him out before the end, even though she really doesn't. Or again, Anthony is her target for the Final Four round here, when in reality, Anthony is more likely to take her to the end probably than Lexus, and I do think she very much overestimates Anthony's win equity. Talking about him as if he's unbeatable at the end, when in reality, she is that person that is unbeatable at the end, where the jury at this point just adored her, and she clearly wins against anybody at the end, all while the jury was extremely bitter at Anthony. So again, it felt like a complete misread of her jury prospects. But then we get to the HOH comp, which ends up being before or after. A pretty boring comp here, though it does lead with Bailey winning out against Lexus in a tiebreaker, being her first HOH win, to where despite the fact that she is targeting Anthony this week, we do see her talking about wanting to actually keep Anthony off the block, to not anger him, as obviously in this position, nominations don't really matter. So here we do also get the BB Can Awards, which, I'll be honest, were pretty boring. I really didn't feel like this one had too much of intrigue, particularly after the awards started getting doled out, though we do get some intrigue from the fact that Jed is there to interview them, and that's followed up by Cozy being there to roast them, which was weird. Also, a lot of the jokes did not hit particularly well, though we do get some humor here from Todd not even knowing who either of them are. But anyway, we eventually get to the final veto competition, where they have to be a stunt performer in their own movie, leading to this pretty cool set piece here of them having to navigate around this derailed train in the middle of a blizzard while having to solve a memorization puzzle and a daze puzzle along the way. And again, all that's kind of cool. And all that, again, fits in line with BB Can's cool production values here. But right away, we do see Bailey and Anthony both struggling at the memorization portion, while Lexus pretty cleanly finishes here, leading to her very easily winning this veto. So right away, it becomes pretty apparent that Todd is obviously screwed, to where, despite us seeing him campaign against Anthony, saying that Anthony's going to win the game, it never really feels like it's going to go through. But I will say, I do think Anthony really seemed to be pushing his luck here, and him actually going to Lexus and having the audacity to tell her that she shouldn't use the veto and allow him to vote out Todd, which was such a wild plan here that doesn't work, and again, should never work. I don't know why this is even a thing he even thought was worth doing, as I get the notion of, okay, if he stays off the block here, he can have that on his resume, but again, why would Lexus want that? And all this can do is just further piss her off to the point where she would feel like she's being controlled by him and want to take him out because of that, to where again, I just felt like this was overall pretty bad play. But again, Lexus ends up using the veto on herself and ends up voting out Todd still, which I do think is the correct move, where I did see a lot of discourse online about how Lexus is so dumb for not taking out Anthony, when I actually think it would have been dumb for her to take out Todd. Now, obviously, a lot of the talk around the jury prospects at this point was that Todd was the only person that Lexus can beat at the end, when in reality, I didn't feel like that was fully the case. I think by this point in the season, I did feel like Todd's win equity was starting to go up a bit, especially after winning the last few comps, and also the increasing bitterness of the jury, to where for me personally, I do think her best chance at winning this game is against Anthony. To where, again, I think she's someone that isn't particularly loved by the jury, and I think she's in the spot where she essentially needs the bitterness against Anthony to get her enough votes to win at the end. And even without her jury prospects, going to the end against Bailey and Todd at the final three is also just dumb from a positioning standpoint. Obviously, they're going to be a duo, they'll take each other, where in this position, Lexus should essentially be guaranteed final two. Now, obviously, it doesn't work out for her, but I chalk that up more to her own poor play and not managing Anthony well enough coming into the final vote. So again, I really just don't agree with the notion that this is a bad move for Lexus, though to be fair, I do feel like Lexus makes this move for the wrong reasons. I don't feel like she's doing this because she's aware how bitter the jury is at Anthony. I actually feel like she feels the opposite. At this point, I feel like she thinks that Anthony's actually going to beat her at the end and is taking him because of loyalty, which is obviously not great. To where again, it very much feels like she's kind of stumbling into the correct call to make here. But anyway, with that, we do lose Todd, who, again, by the end of it, I did find him to be a somewhat humorous character. Again, initially, I thought he was going to be a massive dud on the show, someone that didn't know the game at all, someone that seemed super boring. Though, again, just how monotone he is made him a very humorous character on the show. To where, again, at the end of the day, again, do I think he's that great of a player? No, but obviously he did pick up the game a bit by the end. Again, I felt like he was doing some things in the middle portion of the game where, again, he tried to pick up Elijah, he built a bond with Tola, he led the charge against Kayla initially at the movie night Massacre, though obviously I do think by the end of his game kind of peters out, and again, he was someone that was never particularly respected by the players around him, and overall, like, not a player I think is that good in the grand scheme of things, but one that kind of grew on me as the show went on. But But with that, we get to the final 3 round, where right after the previous eviction, we get the players being called in for a special surprise, that being that we get the reveal of the secret sponsor for the season, that being Disney, who gives them a preview of Inside Out 2. Because obviously, I mean, they did a similar thing last season. Again, all this is really stupid. But we do also end the penultimate episode with the jury roundtable, which was very strange. Obviously, these are typically relegated for the finale. However, the finale of this season had to be 90 minutes because it going after Survivor, to where you think that that was a reason why they pushed it to this episode instead. And this was a very enlightening jury roundtable, one where you could just see how much bitterness there was within this jury, particularly again towards Anthony and towards Lexus. And we see them clearly rooting for Bailey as we see them cheering after hearing that Bailey won the Final Four HOH. But again, we see a lot of bitterness coming from Victoria, who brings out a trash bag saying that she had it in anticipation of Anthony showing up, and it says that he needs to show some loyalty because that's obviously what Spicy V is all about. He talks about how he took her out because he knows that she's the better all-star, which I think in reality is probably what this is all about, is that she's upset that the other all-star got the better of her. While we also have her saying who when asked about Lexus, and saying that all she did is cuddle up to Matt and Anthony, which straight up felt very gendered here. I feel like her entire view of Lexus's game simply came from her just not liking Lexus from the very beginning, where again she continuously claims that it's because she attached herself to Matt, when in reality we saw in the digital dailies that she hated her from day one, to where overall again I thought this was a bad look for Victoria. Also a bad look for Avery here, and her coming off very dismissive of Todd, calling him Bailey's puppet to his face and saying that she played you like a fiddle, which again I would say about you with Anthony and Victoria, but also does even make sense. Like, how was Todd played like a fiddle when Bailey was actually loyal to him? Which obviously it's her trying to rationalize her thinking that Bailey played a better game. But all of this came off very ridiculous to me. But with that, we get to the actual finale, which starts off with a almost 15-minute recap. But outside that, this ends up being an extremely rushed finale, clearly due to the 90-minute time slot that they got instead of the normal 2-hour one. Which, I mean, while it probably worked out for the better in the sense that, again, this is essentially a finale where we're just getting moment after moment after moment, no real downtime throughout a lot of it, it still does lead to some aspects of it coming off as anticlimactic to me. But again, we get to part 1 of the HOH, which ends up being a pretty physical comp here of you having to run up and down and grab balls to roll down to a shoot, though obviously that aspect of the challenge ends up being more important here, especially with the fact that you have to land 36 balls and all of them have to land in the right tubes. And really this did seem like an extremely difficult challenge here, but we do see Anthony pulling out the win here, leading us to a Bailey Lexus battle in part 2, which ends up being a comp mixing your day's knowledge with stacking, and Bailey clearly wins this one, with Lexus seeming to take her time here and also just outright just not knowing the answers to these questions. So we get to part 3 of Anthony versus Bailey, which obviously ends up being the typical Q&A, but again, this seemed like a really tense challenge here, as again, this should have been a game-deciding challenge, though it turns out that Bailey had already won the game by this point. But we do get a lot of back and forth here, leading up to a tiebreaker, with, again, the comp feeling a bit condensed for the show here, where supposedly they really took their time with these questions, and there were supposedly more sudden death questions, only for, again, all those to be rushed through or just skipped over in the show. But we do end up seeing Anthony win the final HOH here, to which in doing so, again, I think you would assume he's obviously going to take Lexus. Lexus is the person that's easier to beat at the end. Again, we saw from so much of the jury that Bailey was this adored figure that everyone wanted to vote for, to where against Lexus it was a lot more marginal. So we get to his eviction vote, where he does evict Lexus. Obviously a very questionable move here. One where, again, up to this point in the season, I think I'm a very big defender of Anthony's game. I do think he played a very impressive game. To while, again, obviously you could definitely fault aspects of his jury management, I do feel like at the end of the day, he did extremely well with the hand he was dealt. However, this is a point where I think this is pretty inexcusable. I do think the move to take Bailey to the end here is just a complete misread on the jury. Now, at the end of the day, I do understand why he does it. I think from his point of view, he thinks that hot chocolate is going to be loyal to hot chocolate in the voting. So I think his assumption is that, if I'm in the end against another hot chocolate member, then more than likely, considering the bitterness against me from Victoria, those hot chocolate votes will go to Lexus instead of to me. And again, taking Lexus out obviously makes it so hot chocolate has the vote for him. But again, that's a misread on him not realizing how close the other women were to Bailey to begin with. And to be honest, I think this decision here makes Anthony's loss at the end a lot more palatable to me. To where while I think Anthony played a very impressive game, I do think him losing to Bailey and again having this misread at the end to just give him absolutely no shot in the final vote, again, feels like a better outcome if Anthony were to lose. Where again, at least it's a position where again, I feel like he at least made that mistake at the end. And also it's just a spot that again, we kind of saw coming. Again, we saw this for a while that Bailey was just outwardly the biggest jury threat. So him losing to Bailey is not as egregious to me as him losing to Lexis, where I think had that been the final two and Lexis won, which again seems like a possibility, I think that definitely would have been a lot more upsetting. To where while again, I don't think Lexis is a bad player by any means. I actually think Lexis is a very underrated player on this season from a lot of the community. I still feel like the strengths of Lexis are really the strengths that Anthony has, because I think a lot of what Lexis does in the game is enabling what Anthony does in the game and enacting the plans that he puts together. So again, if it's Anthony versus Lexis, I do think if Lexis were to win, I think it would just be purely out of this anti-Anthony sentiment, though in the situation that we do see play out of Anthony versus Bailey, I think there's a lot more pro-Bailey sentiment, to where while there is still anti-Anthony sentiment from the jury, again, they were always going to vote for Bailey over Anthony. And even as they leave the game, before a lot of this bitterness started to mass, we do still see a lot of the jury members saying that they're more likely to vote for Bailey than Anthony. So where again, like overall, this is just a complete misread from Anthony that again, at the end of the day, makes his loss at the very end a lot more palatable to me. But with that, again, we do lose Lexis here, who again, I think is an underrated player on this season. Again, we see a lot of the jury talking about how, Lexis did nothing, when in reality, again, I think Lexis did do things. So I think Lexis was given a pretty bad hand coming into this season. So while she is part of the Hot Chocolate Alliance and attached to that, she's someone that was never really trusted within that alliance. We see from day one on the digital dailies that the Hot Chocolate Alliance already did not trust her and did not really want her to be involved in their group. It was always an expendable number for them, to where, considering the fact that she was constantly pushed away by these people that she wanted to genuinely work with, I think the fact that she was able to find this other grouping, be in an alliance with the likes of Matt and Anthony and Tola, and navigate through the game alongside Anthony, again, helping him enact some of these bigger moves that Anthony was able to pull in taking out Kayla and taking out Spicy. Again, I think Lexis plays a pretty solid game on this season. Now, again, in comparison to Anthony, I personally think Anthony definitely played better. I would say Bailey played better. But again, I think Lexis is a pretty understated player on the season. Now, from a character standpoint, I do find her kind of bland. I don't think she really brought much entertainment to the show. To where out of the endgamers, I definitely feel like she's the least entertaining of the bunch. But again, as a player, I do think she definitely had some acumen to her, to where while I don't love how much she preached on loyalty over money, I do think she still comes off as a pretty competent player on this season. But with that, we're now at the final two, where the season's pretty much already over. It's obviously Bailey's just gonna win. However, before the jurors even come out, we do get the segment talking to the pre-jurors, which was very strange here. Again, clearly a ramification of them trying to condense the overall finale format to fit within the shortened time slot, but nothing of note really comes from this. And we also don't get any good reactions to Lexis being evicted here, where the entire jury just seemed to just not care when that happened. But anyway, we get to the jury Q&A, which straight up I thought would be a bit spicier, to where we got a lot of this hype of the jury talking about how hard they're gonna go at the finalists. Yet here it just kind of felt like none of this really mattered, as the jury clearly already had their minds made up, and very few of them even seemed to even be bothering listening to their answers. Though we do obviously see people making faces to Anthony's responses, again making it clear that he's not winning here. But in terms of the performances, I do think Bailey does pretty well here, obviously really hammering home how honest of a game she ended up playing, which again typically I do think would be a mistake, that this jury obviously seemed really hung up on that and wanting to reward a person that played an honest and loyal game for whatever reason. I was pretty impressed with how she articulated her relationship with Anthony and the work she put into building her relationship with Anthony. Overall, I felt like her performance was pretty solid, all while we have Anthony's performance, which was definitely a bit more mixed in my eyes, where I do think he does a pretty good job describing his strategy, explaining why he couldn't go to the end with Hot Chocolate, and ends up propping up Spicy V in the way that she wanted him to, and talking about her incredible social game and how he wouldn't win against her at the end, which Spicy V specifically said that if he owns up his game, I'm gonna vote for him. And who would have guessed she doesn't vote for him? But again, he does once again show a lack of awareness here and talking about how he took out Lexis as he thought he had a better chance against Bailey, which I should also mention, his move to take out Lexis also just further perpetuates this notion of him being a dishonest player, where again, I think that it just makes the Bailey move even worse, where at least if he took Lexis to the end, he could still claim he was loyal to Hot Chocolate, to where in this position, it allows the jury to perceive it as more so him backstabbing Hot Chocolate needlessly throughout the game. I also, again, did not particularly love his final speech, where while I do agree with his overall sentiment of saying that the game of Big Brother is more about your social game than comps, I feel like the arguments he was making there weren't particularly relevant here, where it's not like Bailey comped out at the end, or really even had more comps than he did, but also he does explicitly just specify that this game isn't about pushing milkshakes, aka the HOH the Avery one, which, again, downplaying Avery's HOH win is definitely not a way to get Avery's jury vote. Along with the fact that it's also really funny that he proceeds to say following this talk about how comp wins don't matter, that he got here through winning the last 2 competitions, which again just goes against his entire previous point. But again, at the end of the day, none of this matters anyway, as I don't think the majority of the jury was ever really considering voting for him over Bailey. But before the winner reveal, we do get Canada's favorite player being revealed, which is obviously Todd, as it was always going to be. But again, we get to the vote reveal where Bailey wins 6-1, where I was actually kind of surprised that Elijah ends up voting for Anthony here, where I was fully expecting this to be another unanimous vote against Anthony, which I do think would have been further depressing for Anthony, obviously getting to the final 2 twice and not getting a single jury vote in all that time. But again, this is a conclusion, as I mentioned before, I think it's definitely palatable to me. Again, while I do think I personally would have voted for Anthony, I do feel like his misread at the very end, along with Bailey also playing a very solid game, again, it makes this not a bad outcome to the season. Actually, I think it makes it a pretty decent outcome. Where, again, as much as I do very much feel bad for Anthony, where you can clearly tell postseason about how he is struggling through this, I think the fact that Bailey won this season is, again, just a very satisfying winner for the season. Again, it's the first female winner since BB Can 6 somehow, along with the fact that Bailey's just an incredible character, probably one of the best character winners the show has seen, to where I do feel like seeing a winner like Bailey here is very refreshing for the show. And definitely a better outcome for me than someone like Lexus going on to win, which is probably the other potential outcome here. But okay, with that, let's wrap up the video by talking about the finalists, starting it off with Anthony. And again, Anthony obviously now is a 2-time losing finalist. And I think this is a spot where you see a lot of discourse online talking about Anthony's not that good and he really fumbled the bag on the jury, when I don't really agree with a lot of those sentiments. I mean, one, again, to get to Final 2 twice in itself is an incredible accomplishment, especially doing so, again, without ever being properly nominated. That is an insane feat to accomplish. So again, majority of players won't ever even get to Final 2, let alone get there unnominated twice. So I think Anthony has really demonstrated himself as a master at getting himself to the end of the game. And when it comes to his jury management, again, I don't think he did that abysmal. So again, like, I do think while he would have lost either way, I don't think he beats Lexus, I don't think he beats Bailey. I think in this Bailey situation, again, I think he just was always going to lose to Bailey. Well, I also don't find his jury management on this season that abhorrent, to where a lot of people are talking online about how Anthony has such an ego and that rubbed the jury the wrong way, when that's not why he lost the game, is because of his ego. To where, again, like, while I do think he would have just genuinely outright lost against Bailey, and when we're talking about the other situations that he would have lost against, where there would have just been this outright anti-Anthony sentiment, I think he loses those more so just because of how Spicy V leaves the game, which I think Spicy V is just someone that's always going to be bitter at the player that gets her out, and especially if there's not this more calming presence on the jury to kind of keep her head straight, like there was with Kiefer in BB Can 9, with Kiefer like trying to guide her into voting for Ty. Here, there wasn't that presence. She was essentially the Kiefer. She was the person that was in the jury with the most influence, and through that, I think it really allowed her bitterness to infect the entire jury. Now again, not saying that there's no fault at all on Anthony for Spicy being bitter, as obviously Anthony should have known that Spicy could have been a very bitter juror on her way out, and through that, again, should have potentially thought about taking her out pre-jury if he could have. Also, potentially sending her out at the tail end of the game, or even not even try to win Final 5 HOH and attempt to turn Bailey and Todd on V anyway and try not to get as much blood on his hands. Again, I think there were other options, obviously, but I do think still a lot of it comes down to just who Spicy V is, and her being someone that was always going to be bitter at Anthony if he ever had anything to do with getting her out of the game. Now, beyond that, again, like, I think Anthony's game on BB Can 12 here is very impressive. I mean, I think it's one that I do kind of correlate to Dan's in BB14's of being someone that's in the majority alliance, but still is making these very incredible moves. Again, him convincing Vivek to take out Dennis is a purely insane move. Him also convincing Victoria to take out Kayla, and him doing a lot of legwork in the previous weeks to build up to that is very impressive. Him also, again, turning Bailey and Todd against Spicy is also very impressive. Like, I think he makes some of his most impressive maneuvers on this season, even though I think as a whole, his game from BB Can 7 is probably a bit stronger and a bit more consistent. But so again, I still think Anthony's game here was very impressive, where obviously I see a lot of comparisons between him and Paul. I think he's better than Paul. I don't think it's even really that close. I think Paul's BB-18 game is not even close, being anywhere on the level of either of Anthony's games, where Paul's BB-19 game is obviously very impressive. It's also one where I think Paul is purely at fault for their own jury management. I think their jury management on that season is absolutely abhorrent and unnecessarily so, where in comparison to Anthony's, again, I don't think Anthony does as much actively wrong as Paul. While Paul obviously gets more jury votes at the end, I think Paul is a much more flawed player than Anthony in the grand scheme of things. And again, for me, this season really just further cements Anthony's legacy. To me, it doesn't really detract from him in any way, but it doesn't really elevate him that much in any way either. Obviously, it shows him being able to be a finalist 2 times, which is very impressive. But again, I already had him in very high regard after BB Can 7. I do think after this season, on my BB Can player ranking, he doesn't really move up. I think he would have needed to win for that to be the case. Or again, I still think Dane and Kevin Jacobs are above him. Now, I do think in terms of the North American list, I do think I would have had him below Dr. Will before this. I think I would have him above at this point. I think you could argue Nicole Franzel. Or I do think on that list, maybe he moves up a little bit, but really, I think my assessment of him as a player is not that far removed from where it was before the season started. Now, outside of him as a player, I do think Anthony comes out of this season being an actual really fun character to me, where obviously on BB Can 7, he was a fun character, but a lot of that wasn't really on the show. I feel like the show very under-edited him and really gave a lot of the screen time to Dane and to Adam, to where I always felt like Anthony didn't really get his due on the show on BB Can 7. Well, I feel like he really did on BB Can 12. And while a lot of people hated him, I mean, again, people were frustrated how egotistical he seemed to be. I personally found that fun. Again, I find the concept of him creating all these nicknames for himself and really hyping himself up when in a room by himself to all just be really humorous moments there, along with, again, the fact that he is so cocky in the DR. Again, it's fun content to me. So while I do think Anthony does have a big ego, it's still one where he's definitely playing it up for the show, and I do at least respect that to a degree, to where, again, I come out of this season pretty satisfied with Anthony's role on it. But with that, now let's talk about the winner in Bailey, who, again, I think was a very good player on this season. I think it's a player that is very tough to properly dissect their game, where it's a game where early on, she was definitely in a lot of danger. She definitely faced a lot of adversity, a lot of it on her own. I do think she plays those first few rounds very sloppily, but is able to overcome that. And by the time that she's able to really convince Spicy V of things that are not in her best interest, really starting from the executive veto on, in getting Spicy V to keep Todd around in the game, and all it does is really harm Spicy V's positioning in the game, is, again, very impressive play there. Now, again, I think you can argue how much of that is intentional, which is probably my biggest qualm with Bailey, especially in terms of my assessment of her as a player, and the fact that I don't think much of her game was intentional until towards the end of the game. Now, I think the thing that was intentional, something that I do think is very impressive from Bailey's game, is how she played in a mixed season, in a season where there were returning players. To her, I think a strategy that she utilized on this season that I think is very impressive to see is the fact that she knew that the vets were going to be tough to get out, and that there's no point in going after them. You should work with them. And again, we see her building these really strong bonds with both Spicy V and Anthony, getting both of them to want to take her extremely far into the game, again, being pretty much the only person that got on both of their good sides. And again, I think that is a very impressive thing to do in a season like this. And again, the fact that she was able to get towards the end game with Todd still by her side, a very integral number there, and also convince Anthony to take her to final 2, is pure insanity. Like, I think there's a lot of impressive play from Bailey on this season, even though, again, I think there is definitely a lot of question marks on how exactly she was able to do some of these things, and how intentional a lot of it was, where, again, a lot of it feels like her being able to convince Spicy that these things were in their best interest, not because she was manipulating Spicy, but because she genuinely thought that. Mainly because she has a complete misread on the game. She doesn't realize what is going on around her. She doesn't realize that there's the directors, that there's hot chocolate, that there are these other alliances that make the moves that she wants to make for the sake of the all-women's alliance bad moves, but again, she doesn't know that. She is genuinely making arguments for things that are better for her game and her assumption for Spicy's game, when in reality they weren't good for Spicy's game. And again, it is a very interesting dynamic there, but again, it's very effective. Again, she is a very effective player. She is one that is able to get people to do what she wants them to do, even though the means that she does it is, again, a little bit questionable. But again, I do look at her as a pretty solid winner of the show. I think a pretty solid middle tier winner of the show, where, again, in a show that has not had the greatest winners, where really I think there's only 2 top tier winners of BB Can, like, because of that, Bailey's towards the top of a BB Can winner ranking, which I will be redoing at some point before BB Can 13, so you can stay tuned for that. But again, I assume Bailey's going to be decently high on that list. And again, from a character standpoint as well, I think Bailey's also an incredible character on this show. I mean, by far the best of the newbie characters on the show, being this very explosive personality that's very willing to get into confrontations, and somehow it not really blowing up her game and actually kind of using it to benefit her game. And that, where again, we see a lot of fights between her and Anthony. We see a fight between her and Tola, her and Kayla on her way out, her and Vivek early on. And we see so many confrontations with Bailey, and she was somehow able to get through a lot of it unscathed. There was just something so raw about Bailey as a character here, to where she just expresses all of her reactions to every little thing and is very willing to tell you how she's feeling. And again, just makes her an incredible character on this season. And again, is a solid player on this season, a very satisfying winner for the season. And with that, that is the entirety of BB Can 12, which as a whole, I do think is a solid season of BB Can. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, again, I think it's a season that I definitely struggled with connecting to. I think it's one that really took until the last few weeks for me to be fully invested in this season. But again, I do think by the time of the Victoria blindside, I was definitely back on board with the season, to where, again, while there were a lot of like really crazy things happening, again, the Vivek HOH week, you had Kayla's eventual elimination, you had just a lot of crazy gameplay from Spicy V. Again, despite all those things, which again would be incredible things on paper, I did find it, again, hard to connect to the season just due to how it was presented. But by the tail end, I did feel a lot more invested in seeing how the game was going to be played out. Again, with Spicy V getting taken out, being extremely bitter, seeing Anthony navigating through the game in a very impressive way, seeing Bailey navigate through the game in a very impressive way. And again, for the season that culminate in those two in the final 2, I think is a very satisfying conclusion to the season, to where, again, as a whole, I think it's a season that if we did have live feeds, I think this could be up there with the elites of the show. I think this would have probably been up there with some of the best of BB Can seasons, though, because it wasn't, I do think it does take a bit away from it in my mind, where again, a lot of that just comes through the personal connection. I just don't have that personal connection with this season, and because I think it's more so amongst the middle tier of the show, to where again, I feel like it's tough to assess alongside the BB Can 5s, the BB Can 10s, when there wasn't as much context around the season. Now, again, if you're just going purely from an entertainment standpoint, from a television product, again, this is up there. Again, I think it's on par with something like a BB Can 9 in its sheer genuine quality, though I do think because of the way that I personally watched the show and the way that I was less invested in it, it kind of falls a little bit below that, even though, again, I think it is a solid season. Again, there were just so many crazy things happening, some really satisfying storylines, some really great characters, to where while there was some very frustrating gameplay at points, I don't think that makes for bad TV. I think it actually makes for good TV at many points, to where, again, I think overall this was a pretty good season of the show, and when that's probably the best that we're going to get with the current format of the show. But again, with that, those are my thoughts on BB Can 12. Now, again, I will be doing a player ranking for the season, which should be the next video that officially comes out, which again, if you want to watch it earlier, will be available on my $5 membership tier before it's officially out, though again, it'll be out on Wednesday. And beyond that, obviously we got Amazing Race finishing up, which I'll be doing a review of. Obviously Survivors nearing its end, where I'll be doing a review and player ranking of that. We also have Tron's All-Stars 4 that is currently airing, that I'll also still be doing a video on. And obviously I'll be back next year to cover BB Can 13 if we get it. Or again, in between now and then, I'll also be doing an updated BB Can winner ranking, so you can stay tuned for that at some point down the road, along with the other typical content you can expect from the channel. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.